If you're interested in becoming a consultant or furthering your career as a technology consultant, you're not going to want to miss this training course. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach the third stage of digital transformation success. I've been a business and technology consultant now for about 25 years, and I don't have all the answers, but I have a lot of answers I want to share with you here today. In this training course, where I'll outline what consulting is, what it takes to be a successful consultant, some of the downsides of consulting, as well as case studies of interviews with another person that will give some additional insights and depth into what it takes to be successful. And my goal here today is really to cover both the art and the science of consulting. I want to go through the things that I've learned the hard way in many cases, and the things that I found that you're not going to learn in other training courses. These are the things that I found to be super important in handling the art side of consulting and some of the finesse behind consulting. Now, as you're watching this video, if you find the need or the interest in wanting to become part of our team here at Third Stage Consulting, I encourage you to reach out to us. You can send your resume to the address I've included below on the screen, or you can go to the links below for instructions on how to submit your bio or resume. We're growing quickly. We're always hiring new consultants, and that's part of why I want to share this training course with you here today. Before I dive too far into what it takes to be a successful consultant, it's helpful to back up and look at the realities of consulting and assess whether or not it's the right fit for you. And one of the things that I cover in this next segment is what I like about consulting. These are the things that I've found to be the most rewarding, the most challenging, and the most fulfilling as it relates to being a business and technology consultant. And once you watch this clip, if you find that you're still interested in consulting, throughout the rest of this training course, we'll get into some of the nuances of what it takes to be successful, some of the dark side, downsides, things to be aware of, as well as use cases, case studies of successful consulting career paths. One of my favorite things about being a consultant is the fact that you're constantly learning. Whether you're a technology consultant, constantly learning about new technologies, whether you're a management consultant, learning about different functions and business processes or strategies within different industries or different organizations, chances are you're going to learn a lot as a business or technology consultant. So that's probably the thing that I love most, is the fact that you're constantly learning. And quite frankly, it's really hard to get bored as a consultant because you're constantly being challenged, you're constantly being exposed to new organizations, business models, and people. So if you like that constant learning and you like pushing yourself to learn new things, management or technology consulting can be a great career for you. Just as you're constantly learning a lot in the consulting world, you're also exposed to a variety of work. So whether you're exposed to a variety of different organizations or exposed to a variety of different technologies, different business functions and processes within an organization, or some combination of all the above, you're constantly being exposed to a variety of work. The good news with this is if you're ever on a project where you get bored or you don't particularly like it, you're not locked into that project forever. You're going to move on to another project that will probably teach you something different and give you some additional variety. So this unpredictability and this ability to constantly be exposed to new concepts, new people, new organizations, new business models, that's something that can be very exciting within the world of consulting. Just as there is a constant variety of work in the world of consulting, there's also a lot of challenging work within consulting. In fact, it's one of the more challenging careers, I think, that you can embark on. And the reason it's challenging is because you're being hired as a consultant to solve a complex problem that an organization isn't able to solve on their own. So you figure if some of these large organizations aren't able to solve a problem on their own, you really have to be operating at a high level of performance and a high degree of capability to be able to do it. But along with that comes challenge, which can be mostly a good thing in that you're never going to get bored with those challenges, but it can create a lot of stress as well. So that's an important dark side to recognize in that. But if you like challenges, you like to constantly learn and take on new challenges, then management or business consulting or technology consulting can be a great fit for you. One of the things that I loved most, especially early in my career in consulting, is working with really smart people. You get exposed to people that have seen a lot of different situations, they come from diverse backgrounds, and a lot of them have impressive pedigrees as well. So if you like working with people that are intelligent and smart and that you can learn from, consulting can be a great career choice as well. Finally, one of the things I love most about consulting is the fact that you get to travel and experience new places and new people and new organizations. So in most consulting organizations, you get to travel to new cities, sometimes even new countries, to experience different cultures and different types of people, which can be a lot of fun, especially if you're just starting your career, or if, like me, you never really traveled much before you started a career in consulting. And so if you enjoy travel, you enjoy new situations, new places, new lessons, all that stuff, consulting can be a great fit for you. Now, I've shared several of the things that I like the most about consulting, but I also want to share a few things that you may not like about consulting, or things that I've seen peers struggle with throughout my career. It's not a typical 40-hour work week. Instead, you're oftentimes working 50, 60, or maybe even more hours in a week. So keep in mind that as a consultant, the way you're oftentimes measured and the way you generate revenue for your organization is to bill hours. And by billing more hours, you're generating more revenue for an organization. So that can be a good thing in some ways, but if you don't like to work a lot of hours, or if you prefer a more steady, stable 9-to-5, 40-hour-a-week sort of job, consulting may not be the best fit for you. Another challenge within consulting that you may not like is the fact that clients more often than not are demanding. I mentioned earlier in this discussion that clients are usually hiring consultants because they can't do the job themselves. They don't have the capabilities to do it, or they're entering into very stressful situations like a big business or digital transformation, for example, and they need outside help to help them through that. So along with that excitement comes a certain amount of stress. And oftentimes the client is stressed out, they're under a lot of pressure, and that gets transitioned over to you as a consultant. So that's something that you need to be prepared for if you do become a consultant. And then finally, if you don't like constant change, if you're a creature of habit, you like stability and predictability, consulting is probably not the best job for you. Consulting a lot of times is really hard to predict. You don't know what your next project is going to be. You oftentimes don't know what city you're going to be in. You don't know if you're going to have to travel. You don't know what the personalities are going to be like. You don't know what type of work you're going to be doing at that particular client before you start. So there's just a lot of unpredictability and change that goes along with consulting. I mentioned before in this video how you can learn a lot, and there's a variety of work, which can be a good thing, but that degree of change can be stressful for a lot of people. And then finally, if you don't like to travel, if you like to be at home and you're a homebody and you don't like to really explore outside of your comfort zone, then consulting may not be the best fit as well. Now that we've talked about what I personally like about consulting, let's talk about what it takes to become a consultant. What are the things that you can do to start to break into the consulting industry? And you may want to actually come back and rewatch this segment after you've gotten through the rest of this video, because quite frankly, you'll learn a lot by watching it now, but you'll probably learn a lot by watching it a second time after I get through the rest of this video, where I talk about some of the pros and cons and different nuances of consulting. But before I get into that deep dive detail, I want to share with you just some of the lessons I've learned in terms of successful consultants and some best ways to break into the industry and how to get started. Whether you're an existing consultant wanting to switch career paths, or perhaps you've worked in industry for a while and you want to become a consultant, or maybe you're still in university and you are interested in becoming a consultant after you graduate. Whatever position you're in, wherever you are in your career, this next segment will talk about how to break into the consulting industry. The first and probably most important trait of good and even great consultants is to listen and to really understand clients and understand what the needs are and ask really good questions. Consultants that can ask good questions and listen and understand a client situation are always going to be better than the ones that maybe know more than you and have better capabilities or better skills than you or better education than you, but maybe they don't listen as well as you. When I'm hiring consultants for our team, I always look at the consultants that can listen the best and understand the best, and that's a key trait that is hard to prove on a resume, but if you can prove it in an interview or in any sort of recruiting process, that's going to go a long way to being a great consultant. Having a breadth of knowledge is one of the more important traits of good consultants as well. So when you think about the sorts of transformations that you're going to guide your clients through, or perhaps you already do, there's a lot you need to know in terms of business processes and organizational change and new technologies, program management, strategy. All that different stuff is important to be an effective consultant. And while you can't be a jack of all trades necessarily and be good at everything, you can constantly be pushing yourself to expand your knowledge and learn more and more about different parts of transformation. So as an example, if you're a project manager, it can be highly effective to go get certified in organizational change management or go learn more about technology. If you're a change consultant, it can be very effective to go learn more about technology. If you're a technology consultant, go learn more about organizational change management and push your boundaries of what you know. And the better you have a big picture understanding of transformation, the better your area of specialty is going to be executed by having that broader knowledge. I remember when I first started my career, I started as a change management consultant for SAP implementations. And one of the first things that I was asked to do was to go get certified in SAP, and I didn't want to do it. That was the last thing I wanted to do as a change and a strategy type of consultant. But in hindsight, I'm really glad I did it because it gave me a good understanding of technology. It gave me a good foundation of how technology works to augment the people and the operational consulting that I felt like I was really good at. So really look for ways to constantly push your boundaries, look for ways to sharpen the axe and continue to stay on top of trends and understanding new ways of thinking and different consulting skill sets that are going to be important to you throughout your career. One of the biggest downfalls of consultants is when they come in with the right answer without fully understanding what the situation is. And I already mentioned how it's important to listen and understand what your client needs are, but it's just as important to also make sure that you're not coming in with the answer preconceived or predefined. For example, many consulting organizations have a cookie cutter approach of one way of doing things, which on one hand gives them the ability to scale and bring on kids out of college to teach them how to consult in a consistent way. But the bad news is cookie cutter approaches rarely work for organizations. There's certain parts of consulting and certain things you do as a consultant that can be repeatable, and maybe the way you did things for your last 1 or 2 or 10 clients could also apply to your next client. But there's going to be a lot of things that don't apply and new situations that you're going to face where you have to really figure out, how do I know which tools to draw from, and how do I tailor my knowledge and tailor my frameworks and my methodologies to fit a specific situation. So it's important to resist that temptation to come in with the answer or assume you already know what the answer is prior to getting to know a client and understand in full what their needs are. In any job you have, it's always a good rule of thumb to try and exceed expectations, whether that be with your boss or your coworkers or whoever it may be. But in consulting, it's even more important because someone, if not you, is getting paid good money on an hourly rate to do the type of work that you're doing. And again, it may not be you that's receiving that money, but your company that you work for is charging good money. And the client that's paying for those services is going to expect more as a result. So what may be okay performance or good performance at a normal organization is probably not enough at a consulting organization. As a consultant, you really have a higher standard and you have to exceed expectations, and you have to prove the value for every hour you work, every day you work, every week you work for any given client or any given project. So really having that drive and that focus and that high-performing attitude is very important and critical to succeeding long-term in the consulting industry. Just to give you one more example, something as simple as not following through with a commitment you make. If you say you're going to get the client something by Monday, but you don't get it to them until Tuesday, maybe the client didn't really need it till Tuesday anyway, so maybe it's okay you gave it to them on Tuesday, but you said Monday, and clients will generally hold you to that and expect more of you simply because they're paying you more, you're the outside expert, they expect a lot of you. So really focusing on those little things and following through on those little things and delivering expectations is just as important as the bigger picture expectations as well. Being perceived as an expert in your industry or in whatever specialty area you're in is an important part of being a good consultant. And the more you can point to examples of demonstrating your knowledge, the better. The better you're going to be able to find new clients, the better credibility you're going to have in the industry, and the more clients are going to trust you. So it could be something as ambitious as creating a YouTube channel like these videos you watch here. It could be creating a LinkedIn group for discussion purposes. It could be speaking at conferences. It could be writing a blog. It could be collaborating with others on podcasts or whatever the case may be. It could be sharing your knowledge through social media. Whatever the case may be, you want to find ways and outlets that work for you to demonstrate your knowledge and to share with potential clients and peers in the industry your knowledge and help add to the knowledge capital that others have. And that's one of the fastest ways to build credibility. It's one of the fastest ways to get your name out there and to really establish yourself as an expert in any given arena. So really look for ways, no matter how big or small it may be, look for small ways to begin with and then work your way up to bigger ways of sharing your knowledge to demonstrate your expertise in any given area. When we're hiring consultants at Third Stage Consulting, one of the things I've learned is it's relatively easy to find people that have the tangible hard skills that we're looking for. It's easy enough to look at someone's resume or their CV and understand whether or not they have the right experience, whether they have the right education, whether they have the right certifications. And those things are all important, but that only tells part of the story. There's an art to being a good consultant in addition to the science, in addition to those hard skills. And in this next segment, I want to talk more about some of those intangible artistic sides of being a consultant. When I say artistic, I don't mean you need to be super creative. I don't mean that you need to really think outside the box. But these are those little things that are actually big things in consulting. And these are the things that I found to be hardest to teach. When I find people that have these intangible skills, it's a lot easier for me to want to hire that person, even if they don't have all the hard skills and the certifications and the educational certifications that I want to see. So I'd much rather take someone who maybe is slightly less qualified but has more of these intangible skills than someone who maybe looks better on paper but doesn't have these intangible skills. So that's what we'll cover here in this next segment, is those intangible aspects of the traits of great consultants. I began my career in the late 90s as an ERP consultant. And I started while I was getting my master's degree, and it was the summer before the second year of my master's degree, and I needed an internship to save up some money. And so I went to our career center and I looked for postings at the university. And one of the postings at the career center at my university was they wanted an intern to come in and map business processes related to an ERP implementation. Now, at the time, I didn't know much about ERP. I didn't know really what ERP meant. I kind of knew conceptually what it meant, but I had never been involved with one, nor really understood what the technology did. But I liked the idea of process mapping and helping define a supply chain and re-engineer a supply chain. So I applied for this job. I got it. I spent the summer doing it and got to work side by side with a bunch of ERP consultants. In fact, this company was a mid-sized manufacturer in Denver where I was going to school. And the CIO had gone to my university at the University of Denver, and he wanted a DU MBA student to come help with the project. So I got to spend the summer doing that. I loved the work, and in fact, he asked me to stay on through the entire second year of my MBA. I kept doing the work throughout the entire implementation, and as I did the work, I started to realize how closely aligned my interests with supply chain and process improvement and organizational change, how closely aligned those skill sets were with ERP implementation. So I decided I want to stay in consulting. I liked the idea of consulting and decided to pursue a career in consulting after I graduated. So during my second year, while I was doing this internship, I also applied at some of the big consulting firms and ultimately landed a spot at one of the big 5 consulting firms helping clients with their ERP implementations. And during those 2 to 3 years that I was at the consulting firm, I was doing a lot of organizational change management. I did a lot of process mapping, process improvement work. Started to get involved with leading sub-teams within the overall project and enjoyed the work, enjoyed the type of stuff we were doing, but ultimately became a little bit dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with the fact that I felt like we were operating in a way that was completely biased and wasn't necessarily putting clients' interests first. It seemed to me as though we were force-fitting technology in many cases into the client situation. So I also decided that I wanted to go work for a smaller company. So I left after 3 years, wanted to go to a more entrepreneurial, smaller company where I could maybe learn even more, maybe be a little bit less biased, and ultimately advance my career further. So I went to a small consulting firm that also did ERP consulting. They focused on the energy and utility space. So a lot of my work for about 4 years was in that space. And during the first 6 or 9 months I was at the company, I really enjoyed it, loved the work, loved how entrepreneurial it was. I got to start managing projects and doing international stuff and started to advance my career in a way that would have taken a lot longer at the bigger company. And then right as I was starting to advance in those first few months, a big conglomerate came in and bought our consulting firm, and I thought I was going to have to leave or wouldn't be happy in the role, but actually ended up really liking it once the big company bought us, because they let us retain our entrepreneurial spirit and our flexibility, but they also introduced us to a lot of big international clients. So I got to do even more international work and some really cool projects during that time. So that took me, several years into my career, and then ultimately decided that I did want to start a truly independent consulting firm, because even at the firms that I was at after the big consulting firm, they were also biased. They were also peddling certain products and pushing technology first. And I really wanted to go start a company, or see if I could start a company that would be truly unbiased, that wouldn't lead with technology, and that would help clients put their interests first and help them manage their transformations even more effectively.
So I started off as an independent solo consultant for about 2 years. And then in 2005, I started my first consulting company and ran that company for about 13 years. And over those 13 years, got to see a lot of different ERP systems, helped a lot of different companies globally implement those solutions, built a global network of peers and clients and executives that I'd worked with over the years. And in 2018, I left that company. I had brought on a couple business partners. We didn't share the same vision, so I decided to start another company, Third Stage Consulting, in 2018. So long story short, 22 years in the space, this is really all I know. And so what I've seen during this time is that there's a certain skill set and certain types of personalities and characteristics and traits that I've seen work really well in the consulting space. And there's others that aren't quite as cut out for it. And there's a wide variety of ERP consultants out there in the marketplace. I don't have all the answers, but I wanted to share today what those characteristics are of some of the most effective consultants that I've seen. So this may sound super simplistic and almost like a no-brainer, but it's really important, and that is listening. I see a lot of consultants that they seem like they're listening, or maybe they do listen, but they don't translate that into what it is they're doing as consultants, or they already have the answer going in, or they think they have the right answer without really fully understanding and listening to what the client is saying. So when I talk about listening, or one of the skills that I look for when I'm interviewing consultants or when I'm coaching consultants and developing consultants that have worked for me, I always look to help people really do less talking and less jumping to conclusions and less recommending and less talking in general, and more just listening and understanding what the client is really saying. Now there's a few different layers here. On the surface, you want to understand what the client's saying on the surface. So for example, if a client says, I really want this project to go well, this transformation is really important to the company, here are the things that I'm worried about, or that we as a team are worried about. On the surface, you want to understand what is the organization struggling with and what does the organization need. But there's a second layer underneath that, which is the human psyche. We're dealing with individuals that have their own issues and fears and worries, and we have to in some ways play as amateur psychologists and understand what it is they're really saying. So in other words, a lot of times CIOs, for example, they tell us that they're worried that the project will fail, or that it will cost the company too much money, or that it won't help the company as much as they had hoped. And when you really dig under the surface and you peel back the onion, you start to understand that what they might really be saying is they also don't want to lose their jobs, and they want to preserve their career, and they want to advance their careers. And so there's an individual human dynamic that you have to understand too, and understand that that causes people to act differently if you understand both layers of that. So what's best for the organization might threaten or compromise or jeopardize what the individual needs are, and sometimes they're in conflict. And so it's really just understanding and be able to navigate those sorts of things, and listening very carefully to what companies are saying, what the teams are saying as an organization, but also as individuals. The other component of being a good consultant is recognizing that to be a good consultant, you do need to have a certain amount of specialty. You can't be an expert in everything. So it might be that you're a technical expert, or you're a change management expert, or you're a supply chain expert, whatever it may be. And that's okay. You want to have that expertise and have that depth, but you also want to be able to back up and look at the big picture and understand how the work you're doing within your area of specialty, how does it affect the rest of the project and the rest of the organization that you're working with. A lot of consultants that I've worked with over the years are very good and technically proficient at whatever area of expertise they have, but they have trouble seeing how it all ties to the bigger picture, and trouble understanding that they also need to understand how their domain affects the other parts of the business. So being able to really look at that big picture, easier said than done. Some people are better at it than others, but the more you can look at the big picture, the better. And especially when you think about a digital transformation or an ERP project, you're dealing with people, organizational changes, you're dealing with operational and process changes, you're dealing with technology, you're dealing with a lot of different components. So you really have to be able to look at the big picture of how this all ties together. I mentioned earlier how important listening is. On the flip side of that, communication in general is extremely important. So it's one thing to listen, to be able to understand, but you also have to be able to communicate well. And step one, and probably the most important part of communicating, is being able to articulate what you understand about the client, and being able to repeat back to them and build confidence that you understand what they're saying, you understand what they're going through. You understand the challenges that you're there to help fix. You understand what that future state might look like and how it might help them. And part of that communication is also receiving the signals back of recognizing that what I'm saying to them isn't resonating, or I'm not quite understanding, or I think I understand, but based on their response back to me, that's not what they're saying or what's on their mind. So it's definitely an art more than a science, but being able to recognize and communicate with individuals, with teams, with executives, to frontline employees, all different types of people, that's extremely important. So just as we need to be good communicators and to work with a diverse population of people, we also want to make sure that we can understand and interact with different people, different cultures. Now, there's a few different layers of what I mean here. First of all, you have individuals that are different. Any given organization you work with, any client you work with is going to have a lot of different personalities, different types of people. Some people are going to be very supportive of you being there. Some people are going to be very resistant to you being there. In fact, they may not like you because you're a consultant and you're getting paid a decent amount, and in some ways you're a threat to some people within the client. So you have to recognize that you're dealing with a lot of different people and personalities, and not to take that sort of thing personally. And it's just a matter of understanding. It gets back to the part about communication and listening, and really just understanding what it is that people are feeling when you're there, and recognizing when they're feeling resistance and being able to navigate that well. Now, the other part of it is that every client you work with, not only are they going to have individual people that are different within that same organization, but every organization looks different. They have their own culture. They have their own tolerance for risk and their own tolerance for certain types of things. Some are more professional than others. Some are more sophisticated than others. Some are more blue collar, or some are more service oriented. Whatever you're dealing with, you're going to deal with different types of organizations and cultures at these different companies. So being able to understand those cultures and adapt is very important. And then finally, if you're working internationally, like a lot of our team does, we have an international client base, and every time we go to a client in a different country, we have to adjust to the individual people that are all different within the client, which is different than other clients we've worked with. And now we're in a different country, potentially, that's different from other country cultures that we worked with. So really just being able to understand and adapt to those different cultures is extremely important. And then the final advice I can give, or the final characteristic that I think is a high priority for good ERP consultants, is to be almost like a chameleon, someone that can adapt to different situations. A lot of times you'll be in situations where it's a very laid-back organization. They don't like suits, they don't like formalities, they don't like PowerPoint presentations. They don't like the stuffy consultants. So you've got to be able to adjust to that and adapt, and know that maybe I don't wear a suit and tie every day, or maybe I don't put things in PowerPoints every time. Maybe I have more conversational one-on-one interactions versus big formal presentations. Whatever the case may be, is really being able to adjust to different situations. And that's one of the things that I think makes consulting so much fun, is you see so many different personalities, so many different companies. You learn so much about people and processes and different technologies. And it's fun to be able to do that. And even after 22 years, I think I can do this for another 20 years and never fully master the art of learning something new every time I'm on a project, whether it's something new about people, whether it's something new about operations or businesses in general, or technologies. There's always a ton to learn on these projects. So you have to be willing to learn and also be a good chameleon along the way.
Consulting is a very challenging but yet rewarding career path. But with the challenges come some risks and pitfalls that we oftentimes see consultants fall into. And it's important to understand what these pitfalls are, not to suggest that you can completely bypass them, but just to be aware of them and know how to react to them when they happen. And ideally, you want to make sure that you can be proactive and try to avoid as many as you can. So what I want to do today is talk about some of those big mistakes that I've seen consultants make through the years, and hopefully this will give you a sense of things you can do to avoid some of those same pitfalls.
One of the biggest mistakes that a lot of consultants make, and that I've seen a lot of consultants make, is that they don't listen. They don't fully understand and recognize what a client is really asking, or what the client's needs really are, or what the client's problem really is. And part of the problem with this is, as you're developing your career as a consultant, you learn more over time, and you start to see more and more different situations, and you start to get more confident in your abilities to be a good consultant. And that's all good stuff, but you don't want to let that confidence override the need to be humble and step back and just listen and understand fully what the client is saying that their problem is. Now, there's two dimensions of listening. One is what a client says to you on the surface, and then the second part of that is reading between the lines and understanding what they really mean. So, for example, if you have a client that says that they're worried about a project failing, it could be that, yes, they're worried about the organization failing in the project, but it could also mean that that individual who's human is also worried about losing their job or about being a failure or a perceived failure in their organization. So it's almost like being an amateur psychologist. You have to understand what people are really saying and what their real drivers are. But regardless, to be effective, you have to be a good listener. And if you're not a good listener, you're going to have a really hard time being an effective consultant. Another consulting failure point that's very similar to the first one, but a little bit different, is having a perceived right answer going into a new situation. And again, this becomes more of a problem as you become more advanced and more established and more comfortable in your career, because you become smarter, more knowledgeable, and it's easy to let that get the best of you. And so you don't want to go in with the right answer early on, and you certainly don't want to have any premature conclusions of what the answer might be. Now, one thing I'll note is even if you're right and you do go in and you have the right answer and it turns out that you're right, that is the right answer for a client, you need the client to understand that you are listening and that you're asking questions and the things I mentioned in the first point. So even if you end up being right from the very beginning, you still have to act like, at the very least, that you're listening and you're asking the right questions and that you're fully understanding the client's needs. Because otherwise, they're not going to believe you and they're not going to trust the advice you're giving them, even if it's the right answer for them or the best answer for them. Now, this is all very important too, because you don't want to be perceived as arrogant. A lot of times consultants can be perceived as outsiders that know all the answers and they don't listen, and that's a bad rap that a lot of consultants have. So you need to sort of bring that level of arrogance down, or the perceived arrogance down, by listening and fully understanding what clients are saying. If you're helping clients tackle very complex, broad challenges and strategic challenges, there's no possible way that any one of us is going to have all the answers or going to be able to effectively figure out the best solution for that client. And that's why it's important not to have a lone wolf mentality where you're trying to do things on your own without the input from other consultants on your team. So to the extent you can work as a team and collaborate with others and leverage the best of the brains on your team, that's what you want to do. There's a common problem, especially later in people's careers, especially when they become independent consultants working for their own one-man or one-woman shop. They end up having a mentality that they're a lone wolf, a single solo gunslinger that can go in there and solve any sort of problem. And in my opinion, those are some of the most ineffective consultants because they don't have the breadth of capabilities and the breadth of knowledge that you have with a team. So make sure you're working as a team if you want to be effective at being a good consultant. The fourth challenge that I often see with new consultants especially is a failure to really relate to clients. And what I mean by relate is not just understanding and not just listening, as I already mentioned, but really relating on a personal level, getting to know people on a personal level, understanding what makes them tick, understanding their personal situation, their personal lives, and just understanding them as humans. And ultimately, people want to work with people that they like, and people tend to like people that listen and understand who they are as individuals. So being able to relate to someone and adapt to whatever their situation might be is very important. I'll give you an example. I worked with a consultant one time who was very proud of a Maserati he had just bought. And he went out talking to the client about how he just bought a Maserati. Well, most people can't afford a Maserati, and most people don't care that you bought a Maserati, so don't talk about your Maserati if you bought one. So that's just one maybe extreme example of how you need to really filter yourself and really think of how you're perceived by other people. And you do have to be somewhat of a chameleon. You have to sort of mix in and blend in with the organization and the individuals as best you can, even though you're always going to be an outsider as a consultant. And one other example that's a little important thing is even just how you dress. A lot of times consultants come in wearing suits and ties or dress very nicely when the rest of the organization is wearing jeans and t-shirts. And not that you have to dress exactly the same, but I had a boss early in my career that told me to always dress just one step above the client. So not so much that you're alienating them, but enough to where you're showing respect and you're being appreciative of your presence at their organization. So those are just two examples, the Maserati and the way you dress. Those are just two examples of things you don't want to do if you want to be relatable to clients. An important thing to always keep in mind as a consultant is that you're being paid a lot, or at least your hourly rate that's being charged by your organization, whoever you work for, is being paid a lot. And so people are always going to judge you on the value you're delivering relative to that cost. So if you're billing as a new consultant $150 or $200 an hour, whatever it may be, people are always going to look at you and ask themselves, are you worth $200 an hour? So you want to make sure that you're not only delivering real value and delivering solutions and real world problems to your clients, but you also have to make sure the clients understand that value you're contributing. So it's a delicate balancing act of not bragging about yourself, but also not hiding the value that you're delivering to the client. So you want to be very transparent about that value so that when they go to pay the invoice and they see your name with a certain amount of hours and billable time and money, they can appreciate and understand the value that you've delivered. Something that's very important to recognize as a consultant is that it's hard work. You're going into situations that are very difficult, and that's why people are hiring you to be their consultant. If they weren't having problems, they wouldn't need to hire you as a consultant. So you have to go in with the expectation that you're probably going to run into some pretty gnarly situations, whether it be an operational mess or organizationally an organization is misaligned, or there could be a lot of political infighting, and it's easy to get caught up in the crossfire of that stuff and to take it personally. Or to worse yet, to say, this isn't my problem, this isn't what I should have to deal with. Well, it is what you have to deal with, and that's why you're there, is to help fix some of those problems. Now, clearly, you're not going to fix a cultural problem that's been brewing for decades at an organization, but you can solve more immediate problems like operational challenges or technical challenges. But along the way, you are going to have to deal with whatever political dynamics, organizational dynamics, cultural dynamics that go along with that. So one of the worst things you can do is blame a client and say the reason they're not successful is because they're the problem. Well, they probably recognize that they're the problem, which is why they're bringing you in to help them with that. So it's important to really keep that mindset and always look at it from their perspective and understand what they're going through, and try not to take it too personally when you do get caught up in some of the messiness of consulting. One of the trickiest parts of being a good consultant is that you have to be an expert in a certain area, and you usually have to pick an area or domain that you're going to focus on and be an expert in. But you also want to balance that with looking at the big picture and understanding the big picture. Understand what your role and what the work you're doing, how it affects other parts of the organization, and understand how the value you're delivering relates to the value that other team members on your consulting team are also delivering value. So really understanding the big picture, not getting too caught up in your little myopic view of the world, but understanding what's happening outside your myopic view of the world is very important to be an effective consultant. In today's day and age of rapid technological change, it can be very easy to get caught up in technology and focus all of your time just on learning and understanding technology. On one hand, that's important. That makes you a potential expert in that field. But on the other hand, it takes away from the things that are even more important to a successful transformation or application of technology, which is typically going to be on the operational and the human organizational side of things. So even if you're a technical developer or someone that's focused on a specific software, you still need to understand the operations and you need to understand the people and the organizational change. You may not be experts in either of those two areas, but you still have to have a basic understanding of how those things work and how it relates to the work you're doing, and vice versa. If you're part of a larger or mid-tier consulting organization, this point is going to be particularly important to you or relevant to you. And that is that a lot of times consulting teams tend to focus on themselves and they have an inward team focus. And the reason for that oftentimes is because if you're working for a large organization, your loyalty really is to that organization. And it can be easy to get detached from the client and lose sight of some of the other things we've talked about in this top 10 list, and really focus on the dynamics of your internal consulting team. In some cases throughout my career, I've been on consulting teams where they're so big that we spend so much time with just the internal dynamics and managing and navigating those internal dynamics and the politics of our own team that we lose sight of what we're really there to do, which is to help the client through their transformation. So if you're working for Accenture, Deloitte, KPMG, Capgemini, one of those big consulting firms, chances are you're more likely to fall into this potential trap, but just be aware of it and really make sure that you understand that this is something that could undermine all the other things we talk about in this video, and you need to overcome that and really look outside your immediate team to work past some of that to be more effective. Now finally, one of the biggest challenges consultants face is that they can't keep up with the changing world. Whether it's a technology you're focused on or best practices that you're deploying or certifications you have, you constantly have to be evolving and improving as a consultant. You have to stay on top of emerging trends. You have to understand where the industry is headed. You have to understand technology and operations. There's just a lot of stuff for you to know. And the beauty of consulting is you're never going to know everything you need to know to be a really, really good consultant. And that's what makes it so fun. Every client's situation is different. And in order to be effective in that changing situation, you need to be evolving the way that you learn and the way you develop yourself in your own skill set. So be sure you're finding ways to stay on top of current trends, staying educated, furthering your education, broadening your education. All those things are extremely important.
As you're beginning and embarking on your consulting career, it's helpful to think about what kind of firm do you want to work for. Do you want to work for a really large, big five consulting firm? Do you want to work for a small boutique firm? Do you want to work for a mid-sized firm? And in order to help you understand where you might best fit and where you might best start your career, I wanted to share with you some of the pros and cons of having worked at a big five consulting firm. I started my career at a big five consulting firm. It made a lot of sense for me at the time, but quite frankly, I didn't enjoy it very much and I didn't last very long there. I was only there for about 2 years, but it gave me a good foundation to start from. Some consultants love the big consulting firms. They want to stay there their entire careers, and some find that some sort of hybrid of both is going to make sense, and some decide they just want to work for a smaller firm. So what I want to do is share with you the pros and cons of some of the big consulting firms, really to help you understand whether or not that's a good fit for you, and if one of the really big consulting firms is not a good fit for you, what some of the other options might be.
Let's start with the advantages of Big Four consulting firms. One of the most important advantages is that Big Four consulting firms have very broad skill sets. They have a lot of different practice areas, a lot of different competencies that they've built throughout their time in business. In addition to having broad skills, Big Four consulting firms also have a lot of resources. Generally speaking, these larger firms have hundreds of thousands of consultants at their disposal throughout the world, which means there's a lot of options, a lot of scale that comes along with those organizations. The other factor to consider is that Big Four consulting firms generally have pretty good training programs. They have well-defined processes and methodologies, and they're pretty good at training people on how to deliver those services. So whether you're ready to potentially engage with a Big Four consulting firm, or if you're looking to begin a career at a Big Four consulting firm, these are a few of the advantages you want to keep in mind. Now, despite these advantages I've talked about, there's also some disadvantages to Big Four consulting firms that are important to recognize and be aware of. First of all, Big Four consulting firms are oftentimes notorious for hiring young, inexperienced people and then trying to train them on the job to learn and become good consultants. It's how I started my career, and I value that experience and that training that I got while working at the Big Four consulting firms. However, sometimes I wonder if that was the right thing for the clients that I worked for. I was billing while I was learning, and I was not only billing, but I was billing a pretty high rate for someone that was just out of grad school at the time. So that's something to be aware of, is a lot of times you get a lot of younger, inexperienced hires that don't necessarily have the street credibility and the battle wounds if you're going through a complex digital transformation or business transformation. Another thing to keep in mind is that Big Four consulting firms are very, very focused on revenue. And even though every consulting organization, any technology provider, any business for that matter, is focused on revenue, and they should be, it's more the fact that Big Four consulting firms are so big that in order to make a project worth their time, they have to generate a pretty significant amount of revenue for themselves as a business. This may not be a huge problem if you're a large multinational Fortune 500 organization, but if you're a mid-sized company, or especially if you're a smaller organization, it may be that the sheer cost and volume of leveraging Big Four consulting firms is too much for your organization. And add to the fact that oftentimes Big Four consulting firms are very good at ensuring they maximize revenue and get as many billable resources on a project as possible. I know I saw it when I was at the Big Four consulting firms. They were very good at getting me staffed and billable really quickly, even before I had any credible experience and credible value to bring to a client. Similarly, a lot of Big Four consulting firms will focus on political gamesmanship. There's a lot of politics in these big consulting firms, not only because they're a Big Four consulting firm, but just any big organization oftentimes will have politics. But I did find in my experience, both within the organization and working with Big Four consulting firms even now, that they're highly political. They're very focused on preserving their self-interest, protecting their turf, owning the project, and making sure that other consulting firms and other third-party providers don't have an opportunity to entrench on what they consider their project or their footprint within an organization. So it turns into a very political situation when you have Big Four firms, especially if you're overly dependent on the Big Four firms and there's too many of the resources on the project. And then finally, Big Four firms are notorious for being relatively inflexible. Because they have such good training, good methodologies, they're so big and they're good at mitigating their own risk, and they tend to hire younger, inexperienced people, they have to be somewhat inflexible. They have to have a cookie-cutter approach to digital transformations and all the steps along the way in any sort of technological initiative. And while there is some value to that, you do want repeatable methodologies and tools and whatnot, you also want to make sure you have some flexibility. And the flexibility comes with experience and comes with having more seasoned resources, which oftentimes the Big Four consulting firms don't have enough of. So you want to make sure that if you're working with a Big Four consulting firm, you recognize that they're probably going to be a lot less flexible than you'd like, and you might have to push them and manage them in a way that ensures you're getting the flexibility you need out of their services. So the question now becomes, do we engage with a Big Four consulting firm? And if so, how do we engage with them? First of all, it's important to recognize your options. It's not an all or nothing, either or proposition. You could leverage a Big Four consulting firm, but you don't have to put all your eggs in one basket. They'll want you to, and they will put an immense amount of pressure on you to put all your eggs in one basket. But if you're hiring a Big Four consulting firm, you can hire some resources from a Big Four firm, and then you can hire some resources from another firm. Now, as I mentioned before, you have to be careful because Big Four consulting firms are very political. They're very good at stiff-arming other third parties out of the picture because they're territorial in that way. But at the end of the day, you're the client. If you want a mix of Big Four consultants and other consulting firms or other independent consultants, you should do that. That's your project. You can do what you want, even if you get pressure from outside parties. The other thing I'd say is if you're going to evaluate Big Four consulting firms either as a client who might want to engage one or as a consultant that might want to go work for one, I'd look very closely at the culture of the organization. There's very different cultures in these different Big Four firms, and they're generally very strong cultures too. And it's not just the culture of the entire organization you want to look at. You want to look at the team that's being proposed to your project or the team you would be working with if you're a consultant at the consulting firm. So the cultural fit is something that's really important. A lot of times that'll be the deciding factor for organizations because, quite frankly, if you look at these Big Four consulting firms, they're pretty comparable in terms of competencies, methodologies, training, caliber of resources, et cetera. You're going to get smart people, you're going to get good methodologies, you're going to get a lot of inexperienced hires as a part of your project. That's sort of a given on all fronts with Big Four consulting firms, but it might come down to culture. You might get a certain feel and a cultural fit that you've got to evaluate that is equally or maybe even more important than some of the other criteria I've talked about so far.
Now, I've talked about some of the things I love about consulting and some of the traits of great consultants, but there's also some reasons why you might want to consider not being a consultant. Obviously, my goal here is not to convince you not to be one, but I do want to give you a balanced view of consulting and some of the pros and cons of that. So in this next segment, I'll share with you some of the things you might want to consider as potential negatives. And for some of you might actually hear these things and think that that's a positive. But if you find any of these things to be concerning, then you may want to consider that as you navigate your career in a potential career in consulting.
So to start, let's talk about what the positives are, the pros of being a consultant. And first and foremost, as a consultant, you get to make a big impact on organizations. You could work internally at an organization and have the same skill set and have the same advice you might give to your internal team. But if you're an outside consultant, you could have the same skill set and the same competencies and come in and have just a different impact. People look to you as an expert. They typically are hiring consultants because they want to go through some sort of change and they're looking for direction and advice. So it's an opportunity to really affect and influence how big, massive, influential organizations throughout the world operate. And that can be very exciting. For example, many of the clients we work with at Third Stage are for-profit companies that produce really cool stuff. They manufacture really cool products. Others are nonprofits that are furthering society. Others are government entities that are helping people. So there's a lot of indirect end results that you get a lot of benefit from or a lot of joy from as a consultant. Most of the challenges that consultants are asked to fix are very challenging and rewarding. So you're solving complex problems, you get to really stretch your brain, you're constantly learning, and you're constantly learning new industries and how businesses operate, the operational dynamics, organizational dynamics, technology dynamics. And it really is a space where I don't think you would ever fully master the area of consulting or the art of consulting. There's just so many different industries to learn, and even within one industry, you have so many different types of companies and cultures and operational models, and it's just a fascinating place to be. So it is very rewarding, you learn a lot, and that can be a benefit of being a consultant. By being a consultant, you're oftentimes setting yourself up to be successful in whatever career you might pursue post-consulting, and it's a good resume builder. So if you have worked with helping some leading organizations throughout the world solve complex problems, you're going to be a lot more marketable, a lot more desirable to other organizations in the future. You may decide in the future you don't want to be a consultant anymore, you're tired of the travel, maybe the stress catches up to you, the long hours catch up to you, whatever the case may be, in which case having that consulting background will help set you up for success in the future. Now, if you're intrigued by emerging technologies as I am, it can be a really fascinating space in consulting to learn about these emerging technologies. And I mentioned before how you're constantly learning about new industries, new businesses, new cultures, but you're also learning about new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, data analytics, or robotics, or machine learning, ERP systems, whatever it may be, you're constantly forced to learn new technologies. And if you want to be effective, you're going to constantly stay on the cutting edge of where technology is headed, and you're going to stay on the cutting edge of understanding how technology works within complex organizations. So if you enjoy technology and you enjoy learning different things and you don't want to be limited or constrained by what any one organization might use internally within their organization, consulting can be a great way to open your mind to other types of technologies and things to learn within those spaces. Now, I just talked about some of the good aspects of consulting, some of the pros, but there's also some downside risk, and that's really what I want to focus here today, or what are those downsides or the cons of being a consultant. And the first is that it's a lot of hard work. A lot of people that don't have strong work ethics and don't like working long hours don't succeed in consulting because it's just too much. If you value the 40-hour work week and 8 to 5 work-life balance and weekends off and holidays off all the time, consulting may not be for you. There's a lot of pressure. There's client demands that can catch up to you. And if you're not prepared for that, or if you don't want to work hard, it's not going to be a good fit for you. So if you're really valuing a lifestyle balance or work-life balance, and you value that more than you value career exposure and long-term career growth potential, consulting may not be the right fit for you. If you've watched my videos for some time, or you've gone deep into my YouTube channel, you've probably seen me talk about some of my experiences working for the big system integrators and some of the downside risk of the big consulting firms in the industry. And if I were to summarize what some of those challenges trace back to, a lot of it is politics, especially for the larger consulting firms like Deloitte, Accenture, KPMG, Capgemini, all those guys. There's a deep-seated political dynamic that can be very unhealthy and very stressful. And it was for me. That was actually the main reason why I left the larger consulting firms. Larger consulting firms typically are focused on protecting big revenue streams with big clients, big projects. And when there's that much money at risk, it drives a lot of unhealthy political dynamics internally within the consulting organization. And what I mean by that, or just to give you a couple examples, is oftentimes you aren't completely transparent with your clients because you're trying to protect that revenue stream. I know I spent a lot of hours in meetings with other team members trying to figure out how we were going to spin or put a positive spin on really bad news, something that made us look good and didn't make us look bad. So we spent more time doing that rather than focusing on how to solve the client's problems. And that can be a very stressful thing if you're not ready for that, or if you don't like that sort of thing. In my case, I didn't like it, so that's why I moved on. So that's something to keep in mind, is the politics and stress of especially larger consulting firms can be very stressful for some individuals. No matter how irrational it may seem, whenever a client has a problem, it becomes your problem. As a consultant, there are high expectations. They've hired you to come fix a problem. By definition, they are struggling. They have some sort of problem that they don't feel like they can address themselves. So therefore, they are hiring you as a consultant. So oftentimes you're going into a situation that is very difficult, very stressful, because the client has some other dynamics at play oftentimes that are undermining their abilities to solve whatever problems they're trying to solve. For example, organizations that are trying to implement new technologies and they're struggling with the deployment of new technologies. Oftentimes it's not because the consultants don't know how to deploy technology. Oftentimes it's because there's internal political fighting, there's unhealthy cultures, there's broken operational processes and things wrong with the organization that aren't necessarily your fault as a consultant, but it becomes your problem because now you've got to figure out how to solve this problem that you didn't create. So a lot of times consultants I've worked with really struggle with that dynamic. And I always try to set expectations with consultants we hire by saying that if you want to be a good consultant and you want to be effective, you need to think about how you can be a better therapist to your clients, because ultimately half the battle and half the value of consulting is listening to and understanding your clients' problems. Even though it's not technically your problem, it really is your problem to help understand what the problem is so that you can ultimately help get to the root cause and help solve it. So whenever there's client problems, they typically become your problems, and there's a lot of high expectations that go along with that. So that's something to keep in mind as you consider a career in consulting. One of the biggest keys to success as a consultant is what I often refer to as the finesse of consulting. It's more of an art, it's not a science, and that is the soft skill of consulting. When I was first starting my career in my early 20s as a consultant, there's a lot I didn't know. There's still a lot I didn't know, but I knew even less back then. And one of the ways I overcame that lack of knowledge and that lack of experience was by really mastering my finesse and knowing how to ask questions, knowing how to read clients, and really becoming somewhat of a chameleon that can respond to different situations and adjust and be very adaptable. So those soft skills are something that are very difficult to teach, and if you don't have them, it can be very difficult to master or develop. So you really need to look at yourself and understand, not only do you have the hard skills, the tangible skills, the technology skills, the understanding of business processes, all the stuff that's important and good stuff, but do you also have those soft skills? And if you don't have those soft skills, or you don't like the soft skills or demonstrating those soft skills, you may want to rethink a career in consulting. Now, the final disadvantage I'll point out here in this video is the fact that for many larger consulting firms, the pace of advancement is very slow. You have to demonstrate a certain amount of tenure before you can move up within the organization. In fact, I grew very impatient, especially being in my early to mid-20s, early in my career, to where I felt like I could do a lot more than what I was being allowed to do at one of the big consulting firms, which is another reason why I left the big consulting firm to go to a smaller one. So you may want to rethink, if you're looking at one of the big, massive consulting firms and upward advancement and quick upward advancement is important to you and you want to constantly challenge yourself, be sure you really think through that dynamic, because big consulting firms are designed to ensure that no one fails on the project. And they've really mastered this whole science of bringing in college grads that don't know what they're doing and putting them in a position where they can't fail. And part of the reason you ensure that you're not going to fail is ensure that you're not going to move up too quickly. They're going to slow you down and make sure that you move up only after you're 100% prepared for that next step in the process. So if that's something that does not sound appealing to you, the good news is there is an option. You can go to a smaller consulting firm. You can go to a mid-tier consulting firm that might give you a little bit more advancement opportunity. The challenge there, of course, is if you don't have consulting experience, it's going to be harder to get a job with one of those firms. So that's the trade-off you've got to navigate, but something to keep in mind as you consider a career in consulting. So this all begs the question, is consulting right for me? I guess it really just depends on your personality and what your goals are. If you like to work hard, you have those soft skills that help you be an effective consultant, you like to learn a lot, you're interested in different types of businesses and problem solving, consulting could be a great career. But if you like more predictability, more stable work environments, things that are more predictable, all that stuff, then consulting may not be a good career for you. And certainly if you don't want to work hard and you don't want to deal with a lot of stress and travel and different types of clients and dysfunctional organizations, then consulting may not be the right answer for you.
In addition to some of the things and some of the reasons why you might not want to be a consultant, I also want to share with you the things that I personally have struggled with in my career. Now, the good news is there's things here that I'm going to share with you that you can navigate and overcome, and it's just a matter of understanding the realities of how the consulting industry works. But I do want to share with you some of the things that concerned me early in my career, and it took me a while to figure out how to get through that and how to find myself in the situation that I'm in now where I feel like I could navigate some of those concerns a little bit better. Primarily because we're an independent consulting firm and we're not affiliated with software vendors, that gives us a certain amount of flexibility to be untethered from software vendors and other biases that I think can undermine client success. So with that all being said, I want to share with you some of the reasons why I had trouble in my career early in the consulting space.
One of the reasons why I almost quit my career in consulting is because of the bias that most consulting firms have, including consulting firms that I worked for earlier in my career. And what I mean by bias is not questioning whether or not consultants are smart or whether or not I felt like I knew what I was doing as a consultant, but instead having a preconceived, predefined answer that we would go into to provide clients. And this was something that frustrated me early in my career, and it's also something that I found to be very common in the consulting industry. Most consulting firms are aligned with certain technology vendors, and as a result, they recommend certain technology vendors and technology solutions because either they get commission for selling that software and or they have a bench of resources that specialize in that type of software, so therefore they have an economic incentive to recommend that product. So that bias is something that really troubled me early in my career. And one of the early consulting projects that I was involved with is one that entailed a software selection. And we went in and evaluated the company's operations, their current state, define the future state, and ultimately our job was to recommend a certain solution. And I remember finding out in the first week of that consulting engagement that we were going to recommend SAP. And being a young, naive consultant, I didn't understand why. I came in with wide eyes, assuming that we'd go in, we'd analyze the situation, we'd go look at different technologies, and we'd make the recommendation that made the most sense for the client. But what I learned pretty quickly was that we were always going to recommend SAP, and that wasn't really up for debate. What was up for debate is how we were going to make the case for this particular enterprise technology. So that bias is something that I learned at a very young age, early in my career, something that really bothered me. And ultimately, it was the reason why I started Third Stage Consulting, to provide that technology agnostic advice to clients and make sure that we weren't being biased in providing that sort of input. And by starting a company that's focused on that technology agnostic view, that was what ultimately prevented me from quitting the field of consulting. The other reason why I almost quit the field of consulting is because oftentimes consulting firms have competing priorities that conflict with that of their clients. I already talked about the technological bias, the relationships with technology vendors that oftentimes fuel a sort of bias in the recommendations that are made to a client. But in addition to that, there's other competing and conflicting priorities. The biggest one being that when you work for especially a large consulting firm with tens or hundreds of thousands of employees, the sole focus becomes how do we keep armies of consultants engaged on big projects? And oftentimes that entails putting consultants on projects that don't really need to be there, or they're not qualified, there's not the budget for those additional resources, but by placing those resources on the project, they're getting more money. And especially with these big firms, they need to have dozens of people on a project to make it worth their time. And oftentimes organizations don't ask the question, why do you have dozens of consultants on this project? So that sort of conflict between self-interest of the consulting firms and the needs and interests of the clients, and that conflict that came with that, is another reason why I almost quit the consulting field. So one thing I'd encourage you to do if you are working, especially for a larger system integrator, is be sure that you're very deliberate about adding value, and be sure that you work for an organization that reflects your values and the cultural nuances that you're looking for in your career. The next challenge I had with the consulting career that I'm in is the inflexibility, the sort of one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach to consulting. And this is a tricky one because on one hand, organizations hire consultants because they have a repeatable process and a methodology and tool set that can speed things up and make things go faster than if they were to try to do it themselves. And it's also a great way to train and groom new consultants on how to perform certain types of consulting. But on the other hand, there is no one-size-fits-all to complex decisions and complex initiatives like digital transformations, and you need to be pretty flexible and introduce that art to augment the science of repeatable business processes. And what I found is that most organizations in the consulting field are not good at that. They're not good at being flexible, but also being standardized and having common business processes and tool sets to help in the consulting engagements. So when you're thinking about what sort of consulting firm you want to work for, it's important to recognize that weakness or that limitation for many consulting organizations and find the type of consulting organization that best reflects the type of work you want to do. Whether you want to be part of a big cookie cutter machine, AKA one of the big four consulting firms, or if you want to have more creativity and more flexibility in the types of consulting that you do, which might lead you to gravitate to more of a small or niche focused consulting firm. The other thing that drives me crazy about the consulting field is the lack of business value that is too often demonstrated or not demonstrated for their clients. And I talked about some of the bias and some of the competing priorities that can undermine business value. But in addition to that, you see a lot of big consulting firms that get so focused on deliverables and perfecting PowerPoint templates and perfecting PowerPoint deliverables that don't add any immediate business value, or at the very least, at the very best, you're getting diminishing returns on those deliverables. So when you think about the type of consulting firm you work for, you want to think about, do you want to work for a firm that perfects really good-looking deliverables and polished PowerPoint deliverables, or do you want to work for one that maybe does that, but also, more importantly, delivers actual business value that can actually help clients through their strategic initiatives and help them execute on their strategic initiatives? And this requires a lot more than just creating nice, fancy PowerPoints. It requires a great deal of knowledge and finesse to be able to do so. So business value is something you really want to focus on when choosing the right type of consulting organization that you want to hang your career on. Now, ultimately, I decided not to quit the consulting field. 25 years later, I'm still here. And I already mentioned that one of the reasons why I chose not to quit is because I charted my own course and my own path by creating a consulting firm that better reflected my values and the way I viewed consulting. But as far as you, what should you do? How do you find that right consulting firm? And how do you know if consulting is the right field for you? Well, first of all, there's a number of other videos I've included on my YouTube channel that are about consulting careers, whether or not it's the right field for you, things that might prevent you from becoming a consultant, or things that you might consider as sort of the dark side of consulting. So I encourage you to check out some of the videos on my YouTube channel that go deeper into this question. But the way I would summarize it is to say, really look inwardly at yourself and what your values are, what you want to accomplish in your career, and make sure that if you do go into consulting, first of all, you are sure that you want to go into consulting and that it's the right career for you. But more importantly, if you do decide to go into consulting, make sure you choose the right kind of firm. Make sure it's the right type of organization in terms of size and scope and scale, what they do, what they believe in, what the values are, the culture. All that stuff is arguably more important than the brand name recognition or what you might see on the surface in advertising campaigns and other sorts of sales and marketing collateral that you might see from these.
Now that we've talked about some of the pros and cons of consulting, I also want to share with you some of my most difficult consulting projects. And this is always interesting to have this discussion because anytime you're consulting, you're going to deal with challenges every day. Every client, every project has unique challenges. There's rarely an easy project that's just smooth sailing. Usually there's a lot of stress and a lot of problems and challenges to overcome. Not because consulting in and of itself is a difficult career, but because you're being hired by definition to go in to fix a problem. The client is hiring you because they have some sort of problem that they can't figure out on their own, and oftentimes they failed in the process trying to do it on their own. And when you come in as an outside consultant, oftentimes you're a scapegoat to that, and you end up taking a lot of the pressure and you take a brunt of the stress, oftentimes as that outside voice of reason. So I want to share with you just some of the more challenging situations I've been in my career, just to share with you a flavor of what to expect in some of these challenges you might experience in consulting. One of the most difficult digital transformations I've ever been involved with was actually the very first one I was involved with when I graduated from business school. And right out of business school, I was hired by one of the big system integrators, one of the big consulting firms, and we had a very large client. It was a Fortune 500 manufacturing client. So because this was the first consulting project I had coming out of business school, I had a optimistic view of what consulting engagements would look like. And I quickly learned some of the dark secrets of what it meant to be a consultant at the time. And this was in the late 90s, and at the time there weren't really any independent consulting firms that helped clients through digital transformations. And I'm going to come back to that point later in this video. So this is a case study of what can go wrong when you follow a traditional consulting model with helping clients through digital transformations. And to start, we were hired to do a software evaluation and selection. The only problem was I sat down with our team, and I had just been there for a couple of weeks, and I was excited to learn about different technologies that might be considered as part of the evaluation. And any ideas I had of exploring different technologies was quickly shot down, which I didn't understand at the time why I was being shot down, until I learned that we partnered with another part of our organization that specialized in SAP implementations. So we knew from day one that our recommendation was going to be SAP. Now the question was not, are we going to recommend SAP, or what are we going to recommend? It was, how are we going to recommend it? How are we going to justify that SAP is the best fit for this organization? And here's the kicker. Our consulting fees were in excess of $1 million to tell the client the answer that we already knew from day one we were going to tell them. So that was the first problem. I became jaded at a very young age, early in my career, because of this, because I didn't feel that it was right. It didn't make sense to me that the client was paying all this money and this was the answer we're giving them. But it did teach me about the inner workings of how consulting firms work, especially the larger Big Four system integrators. And it also gave me the idea for what would later become a business that I started. Now, in addition to this rude awakening I had as a consultant, I also learned very quickly about what internal politics can do to an organization and its digital transformation. Not only did the organization or the client themselves have a lot of internal politics and infighting that was happening at the time, their industry at that time was being disrupted. They were going through a lot of turmoil. There's a lot of pressure on their revenues and their margins. And so there's a lot of pressure that went along with that, and a lot of politics. At the same time, because we were part of a big consulting team, we had our own internal politics and infighting that we were trying to work out. And by the way, we were billing the client for that time to work out our own internal issues. So this was a very difficult project for me, and it actually did make me question if I chose the right career and the right profession and the right company to be working for. I ultimately decided it was the right career and the right profession, but ultimately also decided that that was the wrong company that I was at. And as I'll talk about throughout this video, I found that it wasn't just this company that was the problem, it was the way the industry was built, and that's what I'll get to here in a second. So if we fast forward a few years after that first fateful consulting engagement at the Big Four consulting firm, I had decided in 2005 that I wanted to start my own consulting firm. I decided after several years of working not only at that firm, but another firm I went to, and quickly realizing over the years that that's the way the industry was built and the way the industry worked. You had these biases and these alliances and partnerships that benefited consulting firms, but they didn't benefit clients. And so therefore, the industry was giving biased information to the industry. So in 2005, I decided to start an independent consulting firm that focused on helping clients through their digital transformations. And one of the most important things to me was to make sure we were independent and that we were technology agnostic. So the very first client we had at that company was also one of the difficult ones in my career. And this was a mid-sized consumer services company. They had a very aggressive growth plan. They were growing aggressively. They had defined some really well-defined business processes, and they acted a lot like a big company that had already scaled. And I mean that in a good way. It was a positive thing. They had very tight operations, and it was something that was very scalable, and they were experiencing the growth as a result of that. But there were two internal personalities that made this transformation very difficult, especially as a young company,
a young team, and at the time I was a young CEO of that company. And it was a very strong-willed CEO who was very difficult to work with. He's very combative. He held us accountable, but also in a way that was almost unrealistic. So in other words, if there were things that were outside of our control or anyone's control for that matter, he would beat us up over that, and we ended up being a scapegoat for a lot of the problems that that organization was facing. And in addition to that, we also had an internal resource that had been at the company for a really long time, and she was sort of that single point of failure within the organization. She knew the legacy systems better than anyone. She actually helped build a lot of those legacy systems, knew the processes inside and out, and she was really the only person in the organization that knew how to do anything with the software. So we were sort of beholden to her knowledge, and she did not agree with this whole idea of going through a digital transformation. So she became very difficult, combative, and it was hard to navigate, quite frankly, that personality type, especially because she had so much influence within the organization. Now, ultimately, she was fired and she didn't survive the transformation, but along the way, it created a lot of hiccups and a lot of difficulties. Now, it turns out that this ended up becoming a long-term client of ours. We helped them all the way through the implementation. The CEO raved about us at the end of it. So despite being beat up by him along the way, we actually got an award from the company for being their vendor of the year at the time we completed the transformation. So it turned out okay, but it was very painful along the way. Another client from those early days of starting my own consulting firm was a large Fortune 500 consumer product company. And they were on an old legacy-based green screen mainframe system that they were trying to migrate to a more modern ERP system. So they hired our team to help select the software and help them through the implementation. And on the surface, that sounds pretty vanilla, like a basic consulting engagement, which on the surface it is, but underneath the surface were a lot of challenges that we experienced with this client. First of all, it was a highly tenured workforce. These were people that had been at the company for 30 and 40 years, and a huge number of their senior leadership team was on the verge of retirement. So you can imagine what that does to people's excitement for change. There's a lot of pushback, a lot of resistance, a lot of people that just wanted to make it that last year or two before they retired without any major disruption to their careers, and this digital transformation was in fact a disruption to their careers. The company was also under a lot of pressure. They were experiencing competition that was undercutting their pricing, they were losing market share to foreign competitors, and they just had a lot of trouble. And they had also run into financial difficulty because of overexpansion. So they had actually gone through a few different ownership changes in terms of private equity buyers, new CEOs, and just a lot of turnover at the top. So that created a lot of misalignment internally because the top brass was continuously turning over at the time we were going through this transformation. And then finally, you add to the fact that it was a relatively less mature organization, less sophisticated in terms of not knowing what they didn't know. And so they ended up falling victim to a lot of the common sales tactics that you see in the software industry. In fact, there was one point during the software selection phase of the project that we were helping them with where we'd actually recommended Oracle for this client. We thought that Oracle was a better fit, and it fit the flexibility needs, the integration needs, and just some of the general functionality that they needed. And not to say that all clients listen to us and all clients take our advice. It's not extremely uncommon for them not to. So in this case, they went a different direction from our recommendation, not because they didn't trust the recommendation, but because the software vendors were such good salespeople. So we had SAP and a big system integrator that was supporting SAP come in, and I still remember their presentation to the executive team, and they came in and gave their little song and dance in their presentation. So at the front of the room during the presentation, they had these two easels that had something on it that were covered in a sheet or some sort of covering. And at the end of the presentation, they had this big dramatic finish where they pulled the sheets off the easels. And what was underneath was a big advertisement that showed SAP runs, and it had the client's name underneath it. So they had done sort of a mock-up of an advertising campaign that they were suggesting that they would run as a result of them becoming a client. And I still remember the oohs and ahs that that got from the executive team. And I still to this day believe that that executive team made a very emotional decision based on that sales tactic. And this is just one of many that I've seen throughout my career, but this is one of the more memorable ones. So that was another challenge with this digital transformation, is we had an executive team that fell victim to some of the common sales traps and some of the sales tactics that can be highly effective in selling software, but they're not effective in making the right decision. Now, 2 of the 3 case studies I've talked about so far were multinational organizations. But this 4th one I'm going to talk about was an even bigger global footprint. And they were a large healthcare organization, and still are a large healthcare organization, that was trying to decide between two technologies and trying to decide which system would be the best fit for their organization. Again, sounds simple enough, sounds like a vanilla consulting engagement, but there's a lot going on underneath the surface there. Most notably it was an extremely political organization. It's probably one of the more political organizations in terms of infighting and unhealthy, toxic behaviors that I've seen in my career. And as you can imagine, anytime you have that sort of backdrop, it doesn't matter how well you do a digital transformation or how well you think you're doing a digital transformation. If you have these fundamental problems as an organization and these fundamental cultural issues, it doesn't matter what kind of technology you try to put in place, it's probably not going to work well, and it's probably not going to help those cultural dimensions. And it wasn't just that there was a lot of politics and infighting, it was also that they were extremely misaligned. They didn't have a clear vision as a leadership team of where they were going, what their priorities were, and what they should do as an organization. And that's something that ultimately starts at the top. You need that sort of clarity from the top down in order to have that alignment, and they didn't have that clarity, so it created a very misaligned organization. The fact that they had such a global and diverse footprint as an employee team and as an organization made it even more difficult. And so at the end of the day, this was one of those projects that never came to fruition. We finished the evaluation, we gave a recommendation. They still couldn't align or agree on the recommendation or even to disagree with the recommendation. They couldn't agree on that either. So they ended up not moving forward with the transformation. And to this day, they still haven't started any sort of transformation, and they're stuck just trying to figure out what it is they want to do in the future. Now, the last case study I'll talk about here today was not only, and still is not only, one of the most difficult clients I've worked with, but it's actually my favorite client that I've ever had. And it may sound counterintuitive, it may sound strange, but I'd say this is a very healthy sort of challenge and difficulty that I've had with this client. First and foremost, this is an organization that's highly successful. They've disrupted their industry in a way that most organizations don't ever get to achieve. They took what was an old school, old way of thinking type of industry in the steel industry, and they totally disrupted that and came in with an innovative model that completely transformed the steel industry. Now, the reason why this company is difficult to work with is not because they're innovative or not because they're a successful company, but because they have a very strong culture. And I think this is actually a positive for them, but it made it very difficult as a consultant to get used to working with them. They have a very strong culture, and they either accept you or they reject you. And you add to the fact that they just don't like consultants and they distrust consultants. They don't have a lot of faith and confidence or dependency on consultants. That makes for a very difficult backdrop, and it makes it very difficult to be successful as a consultant in this environment. But the good news is we figured out over time how to navigate that environment and how to really understand their culture and how to best help them and do it in a way that was unique to them and to really fit their environment. And to this day, they're still a client. We've been doing work for them for several years now. I want to say 5 or 7 years my team has been working with the same client, and we continue to help them through massive transformation initiatives that they continuously have. In some cases, they're big enterprise-wide technologies. In other cases, it's been business intelligence and other sorts of technologies. So it's been a really fun ride, but it's also one of the more difficult ones. But it's also probably been the most rewarding client I've ever worked with. Not only is it my favorite, but it's the one I've probably learned the most from, and the one that I've found on a personal level to be the most rewarding. So that's something that's worth noting as well. And as I've talked about this and other case studies throughout the discussion here today, my whole idea was to share with you some of the digital transformation lessons that come along with that, as well as some of the career lessons too, and making sure that you stay true to what it is you want to do. And so I hope this has provided some context and some understanding of what it takes to be successful in a digital transformation, as well as how to navigate successfully within your career, within the world of digital transformation. So now that we've talked about the good, the bad, the ugly of consulting, now it's worth talking about how to start your career as a consultant, how to begin your career as a consultant, how to get into the industry, how to position yourself, and how to manage your career within the consulting space. So in this next segment, we'll cover some of the ways that you can get started in the consulting industry. One of the first things that can help you get started in the field of consulting is to find your niche and really hone in and focus on an area that'll give you a little bit of traction and a starting point in the field of consulting. Consulting is very different and unique in that there's so many different things to learn, and it's a very broad field. It spans everything from business to technology to everything in between, and it can be overwhelming and daunting to figure out where to start. And ultimately, over time, you do want to learn as much as you can and have a big picture view of the different aspects of consulting. But to get started, you really need to have that niche, that area of focus where you can really get started.
And that's one of the first things you need to do to be able to break into consulting, is to define what it is you want to specialize in, at least to start, knowing that once you have that area of specialization, you can choose a number of different paths forward. You might go deep and continue to go deeper into that one area that you've chosen, or you might find that it makes more sense, or you're more interested in expanding your horizons and broadening your skill set. But regardless, you want to start with that area of focus. And just to give you a few examples or options of how you might do that, it's important to think about and ask yourselves questions related to what kind of consulting do I want to do, and what kind of consultant do I want to be. For example, do I want to be a technical configurator, someone that's really hands-on from a technical perspective and doing a lot of implementation-related work? If so, then what type of technology might I focus on? Am I going to focus on ERP software, supply chain software, custom development software? What types of technology am I going to focus on? There's also other newer emerging disciplines like data science and artificial intelligence. That's a hot area that you might decide to focus on. You might decide to be a business process analyst and focus more on the business operation side of things. You might focus on organizational change and the human components of change. You might start as a project analyst or a project management assistant, someone that really is more on a program management sort of a track. Those are just a few examples of the type of consulting that you might choose to focus on. And once you've done that, that gives you a foot in the door or a potential entry point to then expand your knowledge and expand your horizons throughout your career. Once you've identified where you want to focus your attention and define what your niche is within the field of consulting, for example, to start, you might define what type of consulting firm you want to work for. Do you want to work for one of the big, large, big four system integrator types of consulting firms? Do you want to work for a small or smaller niche consulting firm? Or do you want to work for a consulting firm that's somewhere in between? Having an understanding and a vision for where you want to start, even if that's not the right long-term answer for you, is a great, important first step. Once you've defined the specific category, whether you want to work for, say, a small niche consulting firm or a large big four consulting firm or somewhere in between, you can then start to hone in on what types of firms or what specific firms within that category might you be most interested in working for. This is where you can do research on LinkedIn and start to understand the different options within whatever niche you've identified within your field. For example, if you decide that you want to be, say, an SAP consultant, SAP is an ERP system that's very popular, and it's one of the most common ERP systems in the marketplace. You may decide that SAP is the niche I want to focus on. Now I need to define what kind of SAP consulting firm do I want to go work for. Do I want to work for one of the big guys like Accenture or Deloitte? Do I want to work for one of the smaller but still decent size, mid-size SAP consulting firms? Or maybe there's a smaller option out there that fits me better. And there's pros and cons to both, and there's different disadvantages and strengths to any of those options you might take. But it's important to understand who you are and what it is you're trying to accomplish in your career so that you ultimately end up putting yourself on the best path to success. Now, one emerging category of consulting firm you may want to consider is the independent technology consulting firm. And that category includes companies like mine, which is Third Stage Consulting. And those are companies that are not affiliated with one software vendor, but instead focus on all different types of software solutions and different software categories. So a firm like Third Stage Consulting could be a good option if you're really interested in growing quickly and learning a lot of different things and a lot of different technologies within the space. And if you're interested in learning more about Third Stage Consulting or submitting your bio or your resume for consideration, I encourage you to email me at work@thirdstage-consulting.com. We'd be happy to take a look at your resume and have a chat or a discussion around how you might fit within our organization. The next thing that's important to do once you've identified the niche you want to be in, as well as the type of consulting firm you want to work for, is to really develop and demonstrate your hard skills. What I mean by hard skills are the more technical skills, not necessarily just technology or software or hands-on technology related aspects of hard skills, but really a discipline or a function within consulting that you want to focus on. The hard skills could be technological focus, it could be configuration or customization or development of software, but hard skills could also entail learning more about change management or learning the different nuances of program management, learning about business processes. See that you could be a business process analyst, for example. Those are just a few examples of the hard skills that you might need to learn. And those are very important. I'm also going to talk about the soft skills here in a moment, which is arguably even more important. But you do need to have a demonstration of your ability to bring some hard skills to the table to whatever consulting firm you might want to work for. And even though you don't have the experience yet, or you may not have the experience yet in these hard skill areas, there's ways that you can develop them or at least demonstrate your ability to do those sorts of things based on your past experience. If you have experience, for example, in the world of supply chain management, but now you want to move into consulting, just as an example, you could demonstrate the fact that you understand how supply chains work, and that is a hard skill. The hard skill, understanding of business processes within supply chain management. If you don't have experience, let's just say you're in college and you don't have a lot of work experience, first thing I would suggest is get some experience by getting an internship or getting some hands-on real-world experience. But you may also have classes you've taken, courses you've taken that provide some of those hard skills, and you want to really make sure you hone in on and focus on those when you're positioning yourself and selling yourself to potential employers. So that's one of the first things you can do, is make sure that you demonstrate and develop your hard skills so that you are more likely to get the attention of recruiters within consulting firms. The single most important key to success, to be a successful consultant, is to demonstrate the soft skills and to have really strong soft skills. And what I mean by this is not necessarily focusing on the things you know, the tangible black and white knowledge that you have, but in addition, also demonstrate some of the soft skills, your ability to communicate, your ability to listen, your ability to understand, your ability to work as a team, to empathize with people, your patience, all that stuff. Those are very important skill sets that consultants need to have. And anything you could do to demonstrate those soft skills is going to help you break into the field of consulting. And I would argue it's going to help you even more once you get into the field of consulting. It's going to help you advance a lot faster than even the technical skills, the hard skills that I talked about before. So one of the best things you can do if you haven't done consulting before is to really hone in and harness your soft skills. Learn how to present better, learn how to communicate better, learn to ask good questions, learn to listen and understand, and really empathize with people. So anything you could do to demonstrate those types of qualities and characteristics is going to help you not only break into the field of consulting and get started in consulting, but also advance and further your career more quickly than others in the field. One of the tricky parts of consulting that can be challenging, but is something I actually love about consulting, is the fact that there's a constant tension between specialization and having a broad focus of business and technology. On one hand, you need to have specialization and focus so that you can provide depth and deep understanding in one area, but at the same time, you can't do that in isolation without understanding other aspects of business and technology and organizational behavior. So one of the best things you can do in starting your career is to have that area of focus and preserve that area of focus to get started and to get some traction and momentum in your career, but also at the same time, in parallel, be working to broaden your horizons, provide value and understand how the big picture works and how whatever it is you're working on ties into the overall big picture. And the more you can demonstrate this and develop that, the more likely you are to not only advance further in your career, but it's going to open up a lot of different options. It's going to give you more alternatives and paths that you could go down within your career. So if you decide, for example, that you want to become a program manager someday, if you broaden your skills early in your career, you're going to be more likely to be positioned to be a program manager. If you decide that you start off at a big consulting firm and you want to go to a smaller consulting firm or vice versa, you're going to have more options along those lines to make some pivots in your career if you have a broad experience base that just opens up the world of options to you. So that's one of the biggest things you can do to start your career in consulting, is to have that area of focus, but also work to broaden your horizons and fully understand how the niche that you're focused on ties into other aspects of business and technology. So through all these segments, we've done sort of a deep dive into different categories, different topics as it relates to consulting careers. And what I want to do in this last segment is play you an interview clip from a podcast I did a few months ago, where I actually had a person who's been a mentor to me in my career for probably 15 or 20 years now. And he's actually an advisor to Third Stage Consulting now. So in addition to helping me early in my career, helping me understand the nuances and the art and the science of consulting, and he was actually my boss at one point early in my career, he's also helped me build Third Stage Consulting into what it is today, and he continues to help us continue growing the company. And I want to share you this clip because not only is it someone that I've learned a lot from throughout my career, but it's also more of a freewheeling discussion where we cover a lot of different things that we've talked a little bit about throughout this training video, but we go into some other details that we haven't covered yet. So this is really meant to be sort of a capstone to all the stuff we've talked about so far in this video. And so I encourage you to watch this interview where we talk about some of the nuances of consulting. Rob, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure, Eric. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. And before I ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself, just a sort of a disclaimer. I don't know if it's really a disclaimer, but just to share with the audience, I suppose is a better way to say it. You and I go way back. I used to work for you 25 years ago. I worked for you, or 20, I guess it was more like 20 years ago. I'm not that old. but 20 years 20 years ago, you and I first started working together. You're an advisor to Third Stage Consulting now, but I learned a lot about consulting through you. And not to put you on the spot or put too much pressure on you, but the reason I wanted to have you on this podcast is because I learned so much about what I think it takes to be a good consultant. I learned through you. So I'm really excited to have you on the show here today. But before we sort of dive into some of these questions around consulting advice and that sort of thing, tell us a little bit about your extensive background in the consulting space and also what you're up to here nowadays with Blue Pasture Advisors.
Sure. I guess it's really kind of three parts, and I'll try not to make this too long. I actually started my career at Bell Labs, and my area of expertise at the time was machine learning. And I read once in a newspaper at Bell Labs about a company called McKinsey, and it got me very interested in consulting. So this is in the mid 80s. I wound up going back to business school, took a job in Europe with a consultancy that did work as the telecom industry deregulated across Europe. And we spent about 2 years there. And when I came back to the United States, I joined a company called North Highland. Eric, you remember North Highland? I know that.
I do.
Business consulting, management consulting, really an awesome organization. I couldn't say enough great things about my time at North Highland. But you could count the number of employees on two hands when I started. And when we reached about 700, things were different. The culture was different. The leadership was different. And so I started my own firm. I put half a bottle of wine into my wife, and out came the name Envision. And that's where the business name came from. And we started. I had a partner, and we wound up being just moderately successful. Ultimately sold to private equity. We merged with another firm, and then sold that to a very large international IT firm. And I kind of retired. But the thing that got me to Blue Pasture is what I really loved to do, which was advising organizations on how to grow. And I was always interested in the transaction part of things. And so that's how we got there. And Blue Pasture has been around now for about a year and a half. It's been a very enjoyable ride so far.
Yeah, it's sort of an opportunity for you to apply your consulting experience because you sort of are still consulting, but it's in a different context now. How maybe explain the types of clients you work with now, or how you made that transition from traditional consulting into what you're doing now with Blue Pasture.
Yeah, at Envision, we work with really the Fortune 1000. So these are large companies, and anybody who's been in consulting for a while knows that you do a program or you give advice, and it kind of goes into whatever mechanism there is within that organization, and by the time it filters through to some result at the bottom, it could be years if you ever see it at all. Working with smaller organizations now, really in the middle market, we're looking at organizations from maybe 5 to 100 million top line. Those results are right there at the fore, right? You make changes, you get to see those changes. It's kind of like running my own business, where I was able to make a decision and make a change. And now it's really through advising the executive teams. But for me, the tie back to Envision was we created 4 divisions at Envision. There was the Envision Business Consulting, a thing called Envision Capital, which I'll get back to, Envision Talent, where we helped place people at our clients, and then we had the Envision Foundation. We gave 5% of our profits to local not-for-profits trying to do good in the communities where we worked. But Envision Capital, the whole idea was taking some of the proceeds from consulting, investing those in smaller organizations, and trying to build wealth for our employees. It was a great idea. Occasionally we got sidecar funding. Ultimately, though, the problem was that in order to grow consulting, it really sucked all the air out of the room. So there was not a whole lot of money to invest in these other companies, which we then in turn hope to advise. And that looks exactly like Blue Pasture today.
Interesting. So you sort of took that idea and sort of ran with that as a focus area.
Yeah, I pulled the piece that I enjoyed the most out of that and kind of resurrected it, and here we are now.
Interesting. So back in the day when you read this article about McKinsey you were talking about, and actually I don't know this part of your background, even though you and I have known each other forever. I didn't know this piece of it, but you read about a company called McKinsey. What was it that triggered or piqued your interest that said, hey, I might want to go back to business school and become a consultant? What drew you to the field?
It was the projects. I can't remember the exact article, but it was the projects that they were talking about. And McKinsey had this cachet that, they were all about business. And it was so funny being at AT&T and the work that we were doing was so focused on one small area. I had no idea that this was going on in the world, that there were actually people who advised businesses. I mean, in a way, it sounds so naive, but that was the truth. It's,
Right.
Every once in a while you get exposed to something that you actually didn't know existed. And so I started to do research, and AT&T was actually very supportive of it and paid for my first year of business school with no strings attached. So my wife and I were actually very happy about that. That was another, little box of gold that we wound up stumbling across.
Especially at that age, that point in your career when you're
Yeah.
getting started out, it's nice to have someone pay for your school there.
Absolutely.
And another interesting thing, I don't want to gloss over this detail of your background, but I find it super fascinating, is your degree was in artificial intelligence, right? You studied artificial intelligence 35 years ago. Is that right?
So, my degree was math.
Okay.
But the work that we did at the time it wasn't really called artificial intelligence. In the 80s, it was called machine learning, where
Right.
I was. And it was a lot of self-modifying code, that kind of stuff. And it really was fantastic. And, for those people who are familiar with Unix and C, I worked in a building where the people who invented that actually worked. And if you had a question, or you could go to, somebody and say, this technology that you invented, it doesn't work the way, as advertised. I was always wrong. I will tell you that. I would go in and I would say, this doesn't work. And they were like, you're using it wrong, or you're doing it wrong. And they would explain it to me, and they were right. And I would go back to work, and I would apply what they told me. But that was one of the greatest parts about being there, was you were just involved with all these just fantastic minds.
Yeah.
Everybody was smarter than me. I don't know how the hell I got in there,
Right.
honestly.
It's a great feeling, though. I mean, it's humbling, I suppose, but it's also a great feeling, because I've had that feeling too, where you're like, wow, I'm around a bunch of really smart people, and I feel a little humbled, but I'm going to just take advantage of the opportunity to learn from all these people.
Absolutely. Enjoy the ride. I'll fake it until
Right.
somebody either figures me out or I find success.
Right. Well, I think that's super interesting that you were starting to touch a field that 35 years ago, I didn't even know machine learning had a name back then, to be honest. So it's interesting that you were doing something that's so hot right now and so trendy right now. So I guess that's one way of saying you're 35 years ahead of your time. You're a pioneer in the machine learning / AI space.
That's really flattering, Eric. Thank you.
Yeah, I know you're too. I like giving you compliments because you're so humble. I know you don't like it. And it makes you mildly uncomfortable. So I'll try to do that a couple more times throughout this interview, just to put you on the spot. But here's a question, actually. Before I sort of dive into some of my questions, I want to turn to the audience real quick. We've got a lot of good responses here to the real simple question: where are you joining from today, and what country are you in? I want to say hello to a few people: Sabir in Lewis Center, U.S., Amy from Houston, Texas, We've got someone from Pune, India, someone from Istanbul, Jazree's from Toronto. We've got someone, others from joining from throughout the U.S. as well. So thank you for being here today. Here's a question from Darian, and this is actually similar to a question I was going to ask you too, Rob, but just to sort of set the context or to get things started here in the conversation, what are some of the things, the number one things that a newer consultant should focus on? I don't want to start with people that are maybe just earlier in their careers or they're thinking about getting into consulting. There's so much to think about as a consultant. There's so much you feel like you need to learn from a technical hard skill set to some of the intangibles. What if you had to pick one thing, if I'm a new consultant, what's that one piece of advice or that one skill set that you think is important?
Well, and not to expand the question, but you have to kind of split it into two parts, I think. There are those who are looking to join a consultancy and kind of what is that number one thing? And then there's once you're there and you started, what's the one thing? I think going into an organization, organizations, I believe, look either primarily at skill set and skill set fit or culture and cultural fit. Because they say, if we have a good cultural fit, I can teach this person the things that we do and the way that we do it, right? Our methodologies, et cetera. Others say, I have certain skills that I'm looking for, whether they're technology assets or whatever, and it has to fit that way. So I would say, which one are you going to rely on? And you can narrow down what organizations are going to feel the best to you when you go in. And then I think once you're in, what makes you successful, at least in the beginning, there are things that make you successful later, is listen. Do a lot of listening. Listen to clients, listen to people who have been there for a while. Share your opinions, but listen. There's a lot to learn. Consulting, I believe, is very nuanced. And one of the things that always got me when I was, I guess, a younger consultant was we would see new people who are coming in and we would talk to them about consulting and they would say, I've worked with 1 million consultants, I know consulting. That is not true. I religiously go to the dentist every 6 months. I know exactly what every one of those tools on that tray does. You do not want me working on your teeth.
Yes.
That's all there is, right? So consulting is really an industry unto itself. We come in contact with a lot of consultants in business, but that doesn't necessarily mean it makes you a good consultant.
Right. Yeah, that's well said. And, the other thing I'd add to that is I think, when you're starting off as a consultant, there's the tendency to want to prove, like you were saying, prove that you belong, like prove that I'm smart enough and I belong in this consulting industry. So I need to demonstrate to you, the client or my peers or whatever, I need to demonstrate all the things I know. And I think, it's hard for a lot of new consultants, especially, to say it's okay if you don't know everything. You can't know everything, no matter how long you've been doing it. So asking questions, listening and understanding what the client's needs are, what their challenges are, what problem that's unique to them they're facing. I think that's a nuance that a lot of consultants just sort of gloss over and say, I've got the answers. I've done this before. I've seen the situation before. I know what this client needs, rather than taking the time to listen and understand. And I think that's one of the nuances that I've learned from you is you've got to ask really good questions and really understand before you start prescribing and, doing your traditional consulting stuff.
Yeah, I think after you do it long enough, you realize that while every problem is unique, all of the business problems probably fall into somewhere between 8 and 12 buckets, right? And you know it. I've heard this before. I have a pretty good idea of what this is. I may need 6 weeks to figure out that I'm right about it, that the problem that I think it is really is this. But you get good at recognizing them, and then whatever solution you come up with really has to be tailored to the organization, because their culture is going to be different. Their processes are going to be different. Their people are going to be different. Leadership is going to be different, right? Nothing, you can't take the solution from here, lift it and put it there. And then there, it just doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. And even if you know what the 8 to 12 buckets are and you've seen those 8 to 12 buckets before, the combination of issues and the way it all comes together in a potential solution is usually different. I mean, it's going to have pieces that you recognize from before that you've used before, but it's like your toolbox. You've got this huge toolbox. You've used the tools before over time as you get more established in your career. But even as long as you and I have been doing this, you rarely see a situation where like, I've seen this exact same situation before. I know it looks exactly like this other client I worked with before. I mean, I can't remember the last time I thought that. I don't even know if I've ever thought that, to be honest.
Yeah.
So really interesting. So just in general then, so listening, you talk about listening and understanding. What do you think some of the other keys are? And you talk about culture, of course, that's very important. I want to come back to that cultural thing, which is a really important one. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But what are some of the other hard and soft skills that you think are important for consultants, whether they're new consultants or established consultants?
Yeah. Well, I think you answered one of them already, which is ask questions. Ask lots of questions. There seems to be this fear, usually for younger consultants, newer consultants, to ask questions, sometimes that they think, they should know the answer to, right? We've already kind of covered that too. I think the truth is it's always great to hear it from the client's perspective of, how do you see this? What do you think is the answer? And another one, especially as you become more mature, is knowing the right time to ask for the business, which is another thing. Business development, I may upset some people by saying this, but I can always find somebody to deliver the work. Always. All right. And too often there's this hubris with delivery consultants that they're the most important. You are important. You're important to the client. You're important to the organization. But some pigs are more equal than others, if you remember Animal Farm.
Right.
And that is the consultant who can deliver, craft solutions, and close a deal is way more valuable to the organization because they are a lot harder to find. And you have to begin to develop those skills. You have to, and it's a lot of it is timing, it's nuance, and you got to understand when the right time is and how to get the client away from whatever it is that they're thinking about to focus on the problem. Sometimes, right, it's dinner. It's a dark restaurant where you have a little bit of time and you can finally ask the question of the client, are you ready to do this now? And this is how much I think it's going to cost. And to be able to kind of craft the solution right there. I used to love that. When I was a kid, we would go to this restaurant called a Ground Round, which some people probably remember. They had peanuts on the floor and popcorn and stuff. But they had this magician, and he would come to the table and he would do stuff right there. He'd roll up his sleeves, and he'd make an egg appear out of like thin air and then make it disappear. And I always thought about that as kind of business development is actually you're at the table there with, right, the client, and you're crafting that solution right there. And you don't have all the answers, but you have enough of the pieces that you pique their interest and they say, yeah, this really makes sense. Well, great. Let me go back. Let me talk to my team. We're going to put this together. We're going to put a letter together. We're going to put it in front of you and we're going to move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great analogy or metaphor with the magician. But I think going back to a word that you use, I think is critical to maybe unpack a little bit. And that word is hubris. And I think just to build on that, I mean, I take it one step further and say I think one of the most damaging or the most ineffective and undermining traits that a consultant can have is that hubris. That, in other words, that thought that I have the answers. I know everything I need to know. And I think, you see this usually people that are more mid to late career consultants that are
They've been doing it for 20, 30 years or however long. They've been working with the same technology or the same type of business consulting. And they start to get this mentality of, yeah, I've seen this before. I know the answer. I don't need to take the time to understand you, Mr. or Mrs. Client, because I've done this a million times. The minute you do that, I think, you become a lot less effective because the client starts to feel like, hey, you're not listening, you're not understanding. Even if you do understand the perceptions, you're not, because you're not taking the time to understand. And then second, it tells me that you're not continuously sharpening your axe, you're sharpening your saw and continuing to learn and understand. And the minute you stop learning and understanding, I think you stop being a good consultant. And the minute you start thinking you have all the answers, I think you stop being a good consultant. But I'm curious here. I know that's a strong statement, but want to hear what your thoughts are if you had anything to add.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback on that, Eric, because one of the mistakes that I've made, and I've seen others make enough times to know that it happens, and it happens like all the time. That's an exaggeration. I don't mean all the time, but what I mean is we can't seem to learn it as an industry. Okay, so here's the situation. You're in a room, maybe it's two of you, two consultants, and you're talking with the client, and let's just say there's three of them there. And this is your third conversation that you're having about this problem and the solution. And during that meeting, a fourth person from the client walks in, and you miss the opportunity to A, find out who that person is, and B, catch them up on where you are. You don't bring them up to speed, and you wind up excluding them from the conversation, and you're never invited back, because the person who entered was actually, let's just say, the gal with the checkbook or somebody important.
CEO or something.
Yep, that you didn't bother to figure out who they were, and you were moving ahead with a solution, and they had a different idea of what that solution was, but you in your mind already thought this was sold and it was done, and you're go and forget, I don't mean sold like dollars sold, but rather that the idea was accepted by the client, and you didn't bother to bring this person up to speed, and the thing falls apart.
And the thing is, it doesn't matter how brilliant that solution was. It could have been the most brilliant, most spot on solution that you're recommending, but it doesn't matter because you didn't sell it. You didn't convince the right decision makers or the right influencers in the company.
That's right. And in a mid-sized consultancy, you really want the client to think in a lot of ways that either it was their idea or that certainly they were part of the solution. I think with some of the really large organizations, if you're going to do, let's say, a large SAP implementation, there's a lot of organizations, right? They've never gone through it. And so they are just relying on you for all your knowledge and all your advice. They have no idea of what this is going to look like. And so, not to say that it's easier, but the path has been walked many times to say, look, these are the things that make this a success, and these are the things that make it fail. And we can take you through that. And so sometimes moving through that process is just a little bit easier than kind of pure play management or business consulting, where the solutions themselves feel very unique to the client because they don't know other people who've kind of gone through this problem before.
Yeah. And, one nuance too, just to add to that is, and it kind of goes along with this whole thread of everything you're saying around listening, asking questions, making sure you don't have this hubris or this arrogance that consultants can sometimes have. But I'm also thinking that, like, a lot of times consultants need to know, or I'm sorry, not consultants, clients, the clients you're consulting to, they need to know that you are listening and understanding. And so I feel like so much of what consultants need to do, but oftentimes overlook, is repeating back to the client what they already know. Repeating back to the client, here's my understanding of what your problem is, for example, or here's my Here's my understanding of those things that are keeping you up at night. You know, these things that are really
Yeah.
that we're trying to address here. And the minute you do that, I mean, in my opinion, is that's almost as important as the solution you're going to come back with. Because the minute you do that, you build this connection and this trust and this understanding that the client says, hey, you understand me, you heard me, you were listening to me, you understand who we are, what's unique about us. Now I'm a little more open to your suggestions. Whereas if I skip over that, even if I do understand the client situation, but I don't prove to them that I do, then all of a sudden I don't trust that you really understood or listened to what I said or what my problems are, what's keeping me up at night. Is that, what are your thoughts on that? Is that something you've seen as well? Or
Yeah, and I think there's a trick to this too with clients, which is I was always fond of saying, all right, this is what I'm hearing. And then I repeat it back. And so there's none of us like to be wrong. I don't want to be
right,
wrong. So sometimes I'm not going to say anything because if I say it, I'm going to be wrong. But if I say, this is what I'm hearing, is this what you're telling me? Nobody's wrong, right? You
right,
kind of it becomes disarming. Well, yeah, that is what I'm saying. And now you can ask maybe some more pointed questions, or they're going to correct you and say, well, that's not exactly what I was saying. Okay, this is good. Then tell me again. Another one was if I was uncomfortable. I always advised our people to say, keep talking. Meaning, tell the client to keep talking.
right.
Okay, tell me more. Tell me more. Just kind of free think for me. And again, it puts you as the consultant a little bit at ease. It gives you a chance maybe to catch up because they're either talking fast and you're not quite getting all the ideas maybe, or they've been in it for so long and you don't understand all the stuff on the periphery. Getting them to talk, sometimes they'll connect the dots for you.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, especially if you're a newer consultant too. That's a great little trick. I don't want to say trick as it's not a scam. It's a trick though to take pressure off you and what you don't know. I mean, you talked about being around people that are smarter than you, and I still, even at work every day, I feel like the people that work for third stage are a lot smarter than I am. But so there's a lot I don't know, and the longer I do consulting, ironically, the more I realize how much I don't know. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I feel like I know a lot, but there's a lot I realize every day how much I don't know.
yeah,
And I think the more you can ask questions, the more it just deflects that pressure to have all the answers and to know everything that you feel like you should know. And it's interesting when you do ask the client things, and when you could, even if you can summarize back to a client what they just said, they give you a little 5-minute overview and you can summarize it back to them right after that. The minute you do that, it's always interesting to me how the client will say, yeah, exactly. And it's sort of like they're sold, that you haven't even prescribed anything yet. You haven't given them any sort of solution, but the fact that you just repeated back to them what they said and you clearly understand it, to me, that's half of it right there. And then the other half, of course, is, all right, what are we going to do about it? And how am I going to help you fix that problem?
right. But I think you often have more latitude in how you're going to fix the problem than whether you're right. You can't take a million years to learn what the problem is.
Right.
I used to have a boss a long, long time ago who said there was no money in current state. There's no value in current state. Get through current state as fast as you can because all the value is in future state. Okay,
Right.
what are you gonna do? Um, and I like your comment about everybody being smarter than you. You know, you're surrounding yourself by with smarter people, and I think good consultants really enjoy that because good consultants really like to learn. And one of the things that makes a great consultant is how fast they can learn, how fast they can assimilate new ideas and data and be able to both evolve their position and maybe change it or explore things that weren't first thought of. So you've come up with an idea of what the solution is going to be, but something else comes and being able to, I hate the word pivot, but being able to pivot and say, yeah, maybe this isn't it, or it has a little bit over here. And I always enjoyed that part too of learning, right?
Yeah.
Learning more. There's, seeking out that other person who's got either the kooky idea or who's smarter than you. The only trouble with that is sometimes it's just hard to keep up with those people,
Right.
um,
Right.
right? That they're coming up with this stuff and they're connecting dots faster than you can, and you just, you know, at the end of it, you got to say, okay, explain that to me again.
Yeah. You're just
Outside
trying
the
to
meeting.
you're just trying to stay afloat.
That's right.
Right. And clients too, I feel like a lot of the learning that I learn every day, and the reason I like to stay connected with our clients, even as we've grown and even as I've backed out of or moved above, some of the day-to-day delivery stuff on the consulting side. I learn so much from clients. I mean, it's so funny because they hire us because we're the ones that know what we're doing. We're the smart ones. We're the ones that have the answers and the experience that they're looking for. But I learned so much just from talking to a client, like the challenges they're going through and, their history as an organization. Sometimes there's industries we'll deal with because we work in so many different industries. There's industries I didn't even know existed. I'm like, there's a whole industry around that. I had no
Yeah.
idea. And or
Yeah.
you built a $1 billion company doing this. I'm like, that's insane. I didn't know that. I didn't know that existed. And tell me more. And so you end up learning so much about just the world in general by being a consultant, which I think is probably the most rewarding part.
Yeah. Well, thinking of that too, I've had clients say, well, why should I hire you? Why should we hire you? And consultants have the luxury of focus, right? You guys here in this company are doing 6, 8 jobs. You're doing everything, right? I can come in and solve this one problem for you because I can focus on it.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. While you run your business the way you've been running it for however long, and I can focus on this problem.
yeah.
Yeah. And also that, you're not tethered by the politics and the internal stuff that, clients have to deal with every day by being part of their organization.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's an interesting question from Amy on LinkedIn. This is an interesting thought. I cannot answer this question, Rob, just to be clear, just because I'm a career consultant. You might be able to answer it better than me. But I've worked with a few consultants at McKinsey and EY that transitioned to consulting with around 20 years of experience working in industry. What are your thoughts on mid-career transitions into the field? So in other words, people that aren't career consultants, they didn't start off like you and I did early in our careers becoming consultants. They decide halfway through or however long into their career, like, hey, I want to take this knowledge and these skills I've built and I want to become a consultant. How have you seen that work in the past in terms of mid-career transitions?
Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag, but some people are just natural consultants, right? I mean, they just walk around that way and they fit into the organization really easy. And Eric, I've seen you hire some people who, you know, didn't have a consulting background necessarily, but you saw in them the, a ability. They were natural consultants. They just kind of worked and acted that way. They asked good questions. They seemed to fit in. They were pretty easygoing, right? Not
They're
very
humble.
arrogant,
Yeah.
humble, exactly. And then you have kind of the other side where people who have joined after 20 or 30 years in a different career who have an expectation that, well, I was a vice president in this organization and I'm coming into the consulting organization and I should be, a big man. I should be a vice president or whatever it is. And that doesn't always work so great because you have to learn the industry of consulting. And so I think he'd wind up taking a step back. So
Yeah.
unfortunately for Amy, I'm sorry that I think it's a mixed bag. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I would say if you're hiring in the consultancy, one of these 20 or 30-year career people from the outside, just interview the hell out of them. Figure it. You'll know whether it's going to be a fit or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Based on the questions they're asking and how they interact in that emotional intelligence, that EQ, I think that's the most important skill. You need someone that has a minimum level of knowledge, that's important, but that the EQ, I think, is regardless of whether you're mid-career or starting out, as a junior consultant, I think that emotional intelligence is way more important than the tangible hard skills you have.
Yeah.
because like you said, you can teach the other stuff, but you can't teach how to be humble. If someone's an arrogant a-hole, you can't teach them not to be an arrogant a-hole anymore. You can't teach someone to be humble if they're not. But
It's a, yeah, that's a big hill to climb.
it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've talked about it in passing. We've been sort of dancing around this really important thread around culture. So I want to spend a few minutes diving into culture here. But in your opinion, what kind of company culture, in the companies you've built and worked with and advised, you advise consulting firms now, including Third Stage, you advise us on how to help us scale and grow our company. But what kind of company culture do you see as being the most conducive to creating great consultants and great consultant output?
All right. So I kind of knew this question was coming at a point. And as a backdrop, as a preface to the answer of this, we get to maybe the definition of normal. And I believe that the way you fit into an organization, best consulting or not, is we find an organization who shares our dysfunction. And what I mean by that is there is no normal. There's weird stuff on both sides, right? We know that. We can recognize that. But take the other whatever, 85% of people, the rest of us, we all have some dysfunction. And if we can find an organization whose dysfunction matches our dysfunction, we think we're normal. We walk in, we're like, this place is great. I get them. They're all like me. And
Right.
And it works, right? And so you think about that. There are some organizations that tend to go to market. They tend to be more arrogant, or they tend to be more introverted, or they tend to be more like golden retrievers, right? And if you're one of those, a golden retriever or arrogant or what, you find that organization, you're gonna fit in, and you can't really say that being one of those cultures is going to be successful or not successful, because they all exist out there, right? And chances are they're looking for clients whose dysfunction also matches the culture of the consulting organization. So when you're looking, it's probably talking to a lot of people to see how they act. I have a kid who just graduated from college, and he was going through the interview process. And I had to remind him that you're interviewing them for these jobs as much as they're interviewing you. And as young people, we tend to go in and we just want them to love us. And if they love us, it's going to be great. Yeah, we all want to be loved, but at the same time, it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to see if they're going to fit with you. Are you going to feel comfortable there, or have you kind of been pretending who you are? And then when you join the organization, I mean, it's hard to pretend for a long time. You kind of have to be yourself. Eric, I don't even know if I've answered your question. I got so lost in my preamble here. So let's kind of attack that one again.
Right. No, that it's great. I mean, you're hitting on something that's real important, which is, back to the, there's two things, the emotional intelligence piece of it, but also the understanding, is this the right place for me as a consultant? By asking questions, like, for example, one question I love to ask, and I actually really like it when people ask me when I'm interviewing people, but when I was interviewing, I used to love to ask, what does the ideal consultant look like? I mean, what types of consultants fit in the best to this organization? And then I'll ask which ones don't. What are the types of consultants or the types of people that you've hired that don't work out here? Or what type of personality or skill set is not going to fit here? And really just understanding, like, does that sound right to me? And then it also demonstrates, it also helps, because again, back to the emotional intelligence thing and asking questions and understanding, by doing that, you're seeking to understand, which is going to build a deeper connection with that consulting firm. But I guess, coming back to this is all, I think the problem here is culture is such a massive Pandora's box of stuff that we could spend 2 hours just talking about a consulting culture, which unfortunately we don't have time for. But the question is more around like the company culture, and what type of culture do you think, or is there a type of culture that consulting firms should have, or traits they should have that's gonna create great consultants and a great consulting output?
Yeah. I think one that allows for mistakes. I think one that pushes younger people to achieve more. I like the idea of having an organization allow a younger consultant to kind of be on the trapeze, so to speak, but operate as a net below them, right? We're going to let you fly, but if you fall, we're going to be there to catch you. You're not going to tank the organization. We don't want you to make the same mistake again and again. So, there's learning that needs to be involved. But I think that and the ability to be entrepreneurial within the organization. Eric, if you think about this, North Highland did a great job with all of us, and it was the leadership at the time. North Highland has gone out and produced so many entrepreneurs. People left that organization. It's like, you did, I did, and I can count a whole bunch of other people who wound up going on their own. And why is that? Is it the way they hired? Maybe, but I also think it was the way they cultivated the people there by allowing us to make these mistakes, by allowing us to do business development on our own and kind of learning how to do that and advising us. Those were probably the two biggest things. And again, I loved that organization. I thought it was a great and it probably still is. It was a great organization that allowed me to really flourish. And other people, I think, would turn around and say, well, Accenture is a great organization. I never worked at Accenture. I couldn't tell you from the inside what the culture is like. So was that a little bit closer to the spirit of your question?
Yeah, it is. And I think culture is something that, is important for you to look at, whether you're interviewing with a consulting firm to potentially go work for the consulting firm, but also if you're hiring a consulting firm, you want to understand and be sure you understand the culture, not just their qualifications and the past client experience and all that stuff. The hard stuff, you also want to look at the soft stuff, which is, can I work for this organization, or can I work with this organization if I'm hiring them? And I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I think it's back to your question of what makes a good consultant, right? Asking that in the interview process, or what makes one successful, and it's the hard skills and the soft skills.
Yeah, absolutely. What about are there any different skills that people need to have nowadays in consulting than maybe was important 10, 20 years ago? How, in other words, how has the requirements of being a good consultant changed, if at all, here in recent years for people that are starting out in consulting?
Well, I think one of the big changes that's occurred in consulting in the industry itself is it's become very broad. Everybody's a consultant now. And certainly when I started, I don't know, 30 years ago, maybe more, there were kind of technology consultants and there were management consultants, and right in management you had operations, you had human capital, you had strategy, you had right there. But now you might have people developing code overseas for $40 an hour that are consultants. They fit into that box. Um, so I would say first we have to kind of narrow the field a little bit. And when I think of consultants, I think of the traditional, right, view of management consultants, kind of where I started of, right, operational strategy, human capital, that kind of stuff, and technology, of course. And then there are even divisions within technology that breaks down further into degrees of specialization. I think, though, that the way it has changed is there is greater need for specialization. So, more focused on your area of expertise, your field of expertise, where I think being a generalist years ago really carried the day. I think it still does. I think it's still a great skill to have, but being able to be a generalist and a specialist at the same time, is great. And then, of course, trying to keep up with, the newer technologies, is also, terrific. When I remember when I was a younger consultant, there was a lot of COBOL out there, and people were looking for consultants. They were starting to pay more and more for COBOL programmers because they just couldn't find them anywhere, and nobody wanted to do it. And so I think that there are still plenty of kind of legacy technologies or legacy techniques that people need to know, because you can make a living there. The only trouble is if you stay there too long, you fall behind the curve, and it's a lot harder to catch up.
Yeah.
So
How do you? This might be a tough question, but I'll ask it anyway. But how do you balance that need for specialization, especially now with technology changing and evolving so quickly? There's just no way for you to know everything about every technology and every business solution that's out there. So, especially earlier in your career, you have to sort of focus and pick an area you're going to hone in on. But at the same time, to be a really good consultant, to be a great consultant, I would argue you have to understand how the big picture works and how what you're doing over here on the technology side affects the people and the process side and the strategy side, and vice versa. So how do you navigate that? And I struggle with this myself, to be honest. I mean, even now, 25 years into my career, I still struggle with, like, how much do I want to specialize versus how much do I want to have a big picture, broad understanding of how business and technology and strategy all fits together.
I think part of that is, it might just be personal, is I realized early on that I was in a career that was very focused, right? We would pick an idea and we would drill just a mile deep. And it didn't give me the same buzz. It didn't excite me the way the big picture does. I'm almost just the way I walk around the world. I'm a strategy guy. I'm a big picture guy. That's just it. My wife tells me all the time. She's like, "Come on, focus," because I'm somewhere else. My head is somewhere else. I'm putting bigger pieces together. And so I admire those people who can focus that way and drill down. But maybe to answer your question specifically, companies also don't move as fast as the technology does, right? They have something embedded in their organization. They're not going to change it every 6 months because things are changing. They're like, I got to run a business. My business is not the technology. The technology supports my business. And so, knowing some of this legacy stuff isn't such a bad idea, because you can actually help your client with the problems that they actually have.
Right.
I think we just have to force ourselves to try to learn new stuff, read articles, be involved in projects that have something new that I haven't been exposed to before. And over time, I think you just get better at putting these pieces together, and constantly building that big picture. I think, right, seeing enough of it it's almost automatic. It forces you to see the big picture, in a way, whether you want to or not, unless you just stay in this very specific place your whole career.
Yeah.
So how's that for kind of a non-answer? That was a,
No, it's a great one, and it's I think what you're saying is there's no right or wrong answer. I mean, I think it's a matter of kind of fitting to your personality, and um, I would say that if you do specialize, I think it's important to at least secondarily understand the big picture outside of your specialization, because you have to understand what the impacts are of what you're doing here over in this little thread that you're honed in on or focused on. There are impacts to other parts of things that maybe you're not an expert in, but it's helpful to understand that, for example, if I, deploy a, off the shelf cloud solution that's relatively rigid or inflexible or whatever you want to call it, that's my specialization. That's okay. Keep doing that. But you need to understand, well, there's a people impact to that too now. Like, people are not going to adapt to that change as easily as if you had a highly customized solution that you're deploying. And so, not to say, well, then you should change your specialization because there's a negative impact potentially. It's just, no, to just understand what that is and understand that the work you're doing has an impact over here. And you have to just be able to, at the very least, empathize with how that affects other parts of what you do.
yeah, I think that's well said, Eric.
I'm just going to pull out some interesting, just random comments here before I get to a couple other questions I have for you, Rob. But here's a comment from a few minutes ago from Sabir on YouTube. It says 1980 machine learning. Some discussion on the Simulmatics company would be very relevant. I don't know what that is, but I don't know if you've heard that term, Simulmatics.
I haven't.
All right. Well, that's all right. It's a little out of scope we're not going to get into 80s machine learning in this conversation, but interesting comment there. Here's another comment, just sort of agreeing with something you said earlier, Rob from LinkedIn. 100% agree. Ask questions before you diagnose and prescribe a solution. So thank you for that comment there. And then here's a question or a comment from William on YouTube. William says, yes, getting real buy-in requires artful communication with key situational influencers. Newbies get a hint of yes and barrel through the process, then inevitably run into implementation problems. So I think that's well said. If you don't take that time to understand the influencers and the politics, that's another thing. You have to understand the politics of the organizations you're consulting to, and not, for better or for worse. There's probably some weird, unhealthy or ineffective politics and things that happen internally, organizationally. You have to understand that lay of the land, that understanding. And back to your point, Rob, the value being in the future state, not the current state. My response to that would be, well, you can't be effective in the future state unless you understand the current state, because you've got to be able to navigate those pitfalls and those landmines along the way.
Yep.
And then here's another, let's see, a couple other comments here. Here's just a fun one. William, who I know watches a lot of our stuff and knows that I like rock and roll. Maybe he even sees the Def Leppard album right behind my head here. He says, FYI, Def Leppard is on tour this summer. Big show. So totally out of scope, but thank you. I appreciate the comment there. So just some fun comments and thoughts from the audience there. So just, I want to ask you two closing questions here, Rob. One is for people that are starting off in consulting, and the other one is going to be for people that are maybe further along in their careers and they're trying to either transition to consulting or take their consulting to the next level. Let's start with people starting off in consulting, people that are just starting off. What closing advice would you have? Like, if you're going to leave people with one or two things as they think about how they enter the world of consulting, what would that be?
I think it's kind of a multifaceted answer of what in this is going to make you happy. There's a financial component to it. Some people are comfortable with travel. Some people are not. I think you got to look at the organization. Are you going to be traveling? Are you going to be local? Are you going to be remote? What does that look like? Is there an opportunity, let's say, to work overseas? Maybe something that you want, as well as, think about, I used the word earlier, dysfunction, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I think you get my meaning, which is find the organization where you fit, where you can thrive. And I get it. Sometimes we don't have a lot of options, right? I have one offer, great. I'm going to take the offer. I'm going to learn there, and then over time, I'm going to move. But maybe it's for every career. Somebody who's young, be patient with yourself. It's okay to be impatient, but be patient with yourself. You need to evolve as well. There are things you need to learn, and you're going to make some of these mistakes. And I always thought it was baloney that you're going to make a mistake and you're going to learn from that mistake. I can tell you there are certain mistakes I have made my whole life. Hopefully, the time between making that mistake has grown and the amplitude of that mistake has been somewhat lowered. But, you know, you got to forgive yourself a little bit. You make the mistake and you keep moving on.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially like you said at the very beginning of this conversation, you're going to be surrounded by people that are smarter than you and have much more experience than you. And it can be a bit intimidating, and it can make, at least when I started off, I felt like I had to be at that level. I had to quickly be at that same level of knowledge and understanding. And the reality is I wasn't. So, I was trying to pretend to be something I wasn't. And that's something I would not recommend doing, because I think it can create some blind spots, and it just puts too much pressure on yourself that you don't need and no one expects you to accomplish.
Yeah, good advice.
What about established consultants, people that are, maybe mid-career, maybe they've been a consultant for a while, maybe they're stuck, maybe they're not sure how to really take it to that next level. What sort of, is there anything you would add to that list for people that are already in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. This group is a little bit different. You need to learn how to sell. You got to get over it. Some people say sales is a dirty word. I don't sell. I had a friend who used to say, I don't sell. I help my friends with their business problems. I just happen to be very good at making friends. It's great advice.
You're still selling.
You have to. That's how the organization that you work in survives. And it's rare for an organization to get lots of calls coming in that say, I need you. I heard about you. I need you. And Eric, I admire you and Third Stage, because you are one of the only organizations I've ever run into that can actually do that. I think Third Stage is a very special place, not just for that reason, but for other reasons. And so you have to find your voice, though. You have to figure out your style of how do you work with clients to develop new business.
Right. That's great advice. Yeah, and I agree. And it's funny you say that, because I am one of those people that say I don't sell. But deep down, I know I am selling. I'm just not. I think there's a difference, though, between selling effectively and trying too hard to sell to where it's ineffective. And I think as consultants, you have to be a trusted advisor. People need to know that you're not only acting in your own self-interest of getting follow-on work or getting additional consulting work. They have to know that you're acting in their best interest, the client's best interest, and helping them. And so I always tell our consultants, if you feel like you're selling, then you're not selling well. And that's one of my favorite lines to use with our senior people. Is it's more of a consultative. I'm talking to you, Rob. I'm understanding your problems. And by the way, here's some ideas I have on how you might fix that problem. And oh yes, by the way, our firm, Third Stage Consulting, can help you do that. And so to me, it's like maybe it's not that I'm not selling. It's just more of a low pressure consultative sort of style of selling that for us, at least, it works. I'm not saying that's right for everyone, but for us, it seems to work.
When you use the word sales and people think of used car salesman.
Yeah.
It's not, call it whatever you want, but money has to flow into the business and somebody has to be able to get it. And if you're sincere as you're talking with the client about their problem and you believe that you have the solution, well, they're going to solve the problem. I would rather that they solved it with me and not with that guy over there.
Right.
But there seems to be this hurdle, and frankly, it is people, I think maybe they feel dirty if they do it because, well, they don't really know the technique of what you're talking about, of how to be consultative, how to work with somebody to craft a solution, and knowing the nuance of timing to say, okay, well, now we're on the clock.
Yeah.
So I've got to put a letter together in order to actually, for us to pursue this together. But, you may be a hunter or a farmer. The farming rate within existing accounts? Are you walking the halls when at the end of the day to see who's still working, and who might need help? Or are you the person who's really good at church, or at your, book club or whatever, to be able to chat to people a little bit about what they do and
Right.
what you do? And the final thing maybe is that the number of times I've heard consulting organizations or professional services organizations somehow finally tell the client, oh, this is what we do that. And the client says, really? And you think, man, you should have been saying that 6 months ago. They don't even know
Right.
what you do. The client doesn't know what you do. You're so afraid to
Sell.
develop the business that you're not even talking about what you're great as an organization at. And something I think to be proud of. If you're doing great work, it's you should be proud of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. And I couldn't agree more. And it's almost like, you have to have that mindset of you want to be a trusted advisor. You want to help a client. Then part of helping that client is showing them what you know, showing them what you can do, showing them how you can help. And you don't have to call it, you don't call it sales, call it something else, business development, whatever you want to
Business
call it,
development.
consulting,
Yeah.
whatever but the point is you need to be able to be effective in that selling. So I lied. I said that was my last question, but I have to ask this question because it's come up twice just here in the last couple of minutes. And given your background in AI, I have to ask this question. So I'm going to ask you two questions. I'm going to read them both, and I'll kind of hone in on the second one because I think it sort of summarizes it. So this will be our last bonus question here for today. First, part A is from Subir. Subir says, consulting is tied to knowledge monetization of culture, business practices, and tangible skills, including technology. How do we see AI's impact to singularly replace that knowledge differential? And then let me read part B, which I think is maybe this might be a little bit easier to get your head around, Rob, and answer it in this way. And this is from LinkedIn, Thurumurugan. I'm 90% sure I butchered your name. I'm so sorry, but this is from LinkedIn. And the person says, we all know AI plays a major role in most industries. How will it impact consulting? So let's just maybe simplify it and say, how do you think AI is affecting or will affect the world of consulting now and in years to come?
Yeah. You have to kind of split it in two camps, that there are people who really dig AI. I think it's going to be the coolest thing. I think it's going to be great. Yeah, everything comes with problems. Every relationship comes with problems. Okay, put all that stuff aside for a minute. I think it's really cool. I think it's going to be very helpful. And then there are people who are just terrified of it because they feel like they're just going to be displaced. I think what you're going to see with AI in consulting is going to be around the periphery at first, meaning I sit on the board of actually an AI company that has a platform that responds to RFPs. You put an RFP into this technology, and in about 20 minutes, it has written the entire answer response without your calls and resumes. And that process used to take days, if not weeks, to do. You still have to edit it and look at it, but it's been trained to go out like ChatGPT and look at the world of RFPs and the responses, and it writes it. And it's, to me,
Brilliant.
it's cool. And so later on, there are going to be two groups, right? There's going to be one group that's using some RFP response technology, and those who are still doing it the old-fashioned way, and it's just going to get them, it's just going to be faster. I'm going to be able to respond to that many more RFPs. I think you're going to start to see stuff similar to that with requirements. So I'm going to ask a whole bunch of questions. I'm going to figure out what the key requirements are. And then there's going to be like everything, right? There's all of these other requirements that we know need to go into the document, but the strategic requirements are the ones that the consultant, I think, is really going to figure out. And the rest of them can be done by AI. It's just going to be, right? It's out there. All these responses are out there. I see that. I see AI being able to help me structure my thoughts if I'm going to do a client interview and what questions I should be asking, um, as opposed to going back and looking at, old questionnaires. Um, I could even today, I could probably go out to ChatGPT and put that in. I'm going to do an interview on this topic. What are some great questions to ask?
Right.
I do not think, though, that AI is going to replace the consultant for a couple of reasons. One, that human interaction is necessary.
Mhm.
It just is. Um, People will believe me more than they will believe some document. They I should have the same knowledge, but there's that personal connection, I think works. And then I also think that there's nuance, that, right, there's tone of voice, that there's body language. There are things like that that only occur in kind of intimate situations where you're
Mhm.
with clients and you're responding, to what they're saying, and they're responding to what you're saying. So I think we are a necessary vehicle in actually, solving the problem.
Yeah. Really well said. I never thought of this until you just said that, but I think what you're saying is true. I fully believe what you just said. And B, I think if anything, maybe it just changes the mix of hard versus soft skills that consultants are going to need to have, because now, the hard skills, the technical knowledge can be somewhat augmented or replaced by AI. But to your point, the human interaction, the listening, the understanding, the body language, the empathy, the human stuff, that suddenly becomes that might become the product. That might become the consulting product now, that's now augmented by knowledge of AI. Not that you can get away with not knowing anything, because obviously you have to know how to teach AI, how to use AI, how to apply it, all that stuff. But you can maybe have less technical depth now and augment it with AI, but the emotional intelligence, the EQ, the soft skills, all the other stuff we talked about with consulting, AI is not going to fix that or automate that for us anytime soon.
Agreed.
So, well, cool. Well, very good, Rob. Well, thanks for taking a few extra minutes to answer that bonus question, and more importantly, thank you for taking the time to be here today. I know you work with a lot of different companies, and you're a busy guy. I appreciate learning from you as always. I've learned from you for 20 years now. I learned from you again here today. Every time I talk to you, I learn something new. So I appreciate you being here today and sharing your knowledge with the audience here today. How can people best learn about you, connect with you, and Blue Pasture Advisors as well?
Yeah. So you can go out to our website. It's thin because we're particular about who we work with, but it's called bluepastureadvisors.com, or you can email me at rob@bluepastureadvisors.com. We have some articles that are out there, on how to transact, but Eric, I love doing this, and love to have a dialogue with people, about what they're working on, and hearing what's going on in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've tagged you on LinkedIn too. So if you're watching this on LinkedIn, just go to the show notes below, the description below. You'll see Rob tagged there, as well as his company, Blue Pasture Advisors. So you can also go there too if you want to connect with Rob on LinkedIn. So, well, thanks again for being here today. Really appreciate it, Rob. And
So I have this training course has provided you some guidance and understanding of what to expect in the world of consulting, how to get started in the world of consulting, how to manage your career, how to navigate some of the challenges and downside risks of a career in consulting. And if you'd like to learn more, if you'd like to explore opportunities with a consulting firm like Third Stage, I encourage you to reach out to us. You can send your CV and resume to the contact information below that I've listed on the screen here, or you can go to the description field below for that email address. So I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to take a look at your background and hopefully have a chance to have a conversation with you to see if you might be a good fit with our team and with our clients. So I hope you found this information useful, and hope you have a great day.